Hey, welcome back, my friend. Or if you're new here, I'm so glad you found your way. Before we begin, if these slow journeys into the past help you relax or drift off to sleep, leaving a like and subscribing helps this little channel find someone else who needs it too. It costs you nothing, and it means more than you might think. While you settle in, tell me where you're listening from tonight. Maybe it's a quiet flat somewhere in London, a cozy little home in Michigan, or a peaceful night in the hills of New Zealand. Leave it in the comments. I really do read every single one. All right. Are you comfortable? Good. Let us begin. There is a house in the middle of the 19th century Sweden with a goat standing on its roof, chewing thoughtfully on a patch of grass, entirely unbothered, while smoke rises from a chimney directly beneath her hooves. This is not a trick of the eye, and it is not a joke someone made up to sell postcards. It is simply what a great many roofs looked like in the Swedish countryside for longer than you might expect. Roofs built from layers of birch bark and turf, packed thick enough that grass took root in them the way it takes root in any patch of soil left alone through a summer. Families let their goats graze up there sometimes, partly because grass is grass and a goat does not care where it grows, and partly because a goat wandering across the roof kept the turf packed down tight, which, as it turns out, was rather good for keeping the rain out. The house underneath that grazing goat belongs to a family I want you to meet properly tonight, because we are going to spend a good many hours with them, and I think you will grow fond of them the way I have. Her name is Elin. She is somewhere in her early 30s, though the work of her life has put a few more years than that into her hands and the set of her shoulders. She's the wife of a charcoal burner named Niels, and the mother of 2 children, a sharp, watchful girl named Britta, who is 10, and a boy named Per, 6 years old, who has never once in his short life managed to stay still through an entire church service. Living with them, in the same low room, is Niels's mother, a woman everyone in the district calls more Stina, old enough now that nobody quite remembers her actual age, including most days Stina herself. They live in a Backstuga, a home built directly into the side of a hill, and I promise you the rest of what that word actually means will fill in slowly across tonight's story. 5 people live in this single low room, and tonight all 5 of them are going to sleep here. Step inside now. Let me take you through the door Elin walks through 40 or 50 times a day without a single thought about it, though I want you to notice it properly just this once. The doorway itself is low enough that Niels ducks his head slightly out of long habit, rather than actual necessity anymore, his body having learned the exact angle, years ago, the way your own hand learns the exact turn of a key in a lock you have used 1,000 times. Inside, the ceiling stays low throughout, which sounds cramped until you understand what it is actually doing, which is keeping every bit of heat the household generates trapped close to the people living beneath it, rather than drifting upward and away into space nobody is using anyway. The room is small by the standard you're used to. One main space that holds nearly everything the family's daily life requires, though small in this particular context does not mean bare, and it does not mean uncomfortable either. There is a single window, deep set into the timber wall, its glass thick and slightly wavy in the way old, hand-blown glass tends to be, bending the outside world just faintly when you look through it. Light comes through that window in a narrow, honest shaft each morning, moving slowly across the floor as the day goes on, and more Stina, who spends more hours sitting than the rest of the household combined these days, has come to know the position of that light, almost the way you might know the position of clock hands. When the light touches the leg of the table, it is nearly noon. When it climbs the wall behind her chair, the afternoon is getting on, and someone should think about the evening meal. The floor is packed earth, the same as you would find in a great many homes of this century regardless of whether they were built into a hillside or not, worn smooth and hard by years of feet, crossing it in the same handful of paths, and over it, in winter especially, sits a scattering of dried heather and juniper twigs, replaced every couple of weeks, filling the room with a resinous, slightly sharp scent that Elin loves completely, and that Per, at 6, has recently taken to calling the smell of home without anyone teaching him to say it that way. He simply started saying it on his own one evening, and nobody has corrected him since, because why would they? So where exactly do 5 people sleep in one small room? Let me show you properly, because I think the answer says something about this whole family before we have even met most of them. The main bed, Elin and Niels's, sits built low against the earthen wall on the far side of the hearth, a simple wooden frame filled with a deep mattress of dried straw, refreshed each autumn with the new season's harvest, so that by winter it holds a particular firm, fragrant loft that softens gradually across the following months until it is time to refresh it again. Over the straw lies a woven wool cover Elin made herself in the early years of her marriage, and over that, layers of blankets that shift in number depending on the season, more in the depths of winter. Fewer once the earthen walls alone are doing most of the necessary work of holding a comfortable warmth through the night. Britta and Per share a smaller bed on the opposite side of the room, close enough to the hearth to catch its warmth directly, but positioned carefully enough by Elin's original design to avoid any stray spark or ember reaching the straw beneath them. A low wooden frame Niels built with his own hands the winter Per was born, sized generously enough that both children still fit comfortably, though Britta has recently begun wondering aloud, in the particular pointed way older siblings do, how much longer she will be expected to share a bed with a brother who, by her account, kicks in his sleep with a violence entirely disproportionate to his small size. Morstina's bed occupies the corner where the earthen wall runs thickest, and the warmth consequently gathers most completely, a placement chosen deliberately years ago. Once her joints began troubling her enough that the household's collective, unspoken priority became keeping her as comfortable through the cold nights as the house could possibly manage. Bjorn the dog claims his spot directly on the hearthstones themselves, close enough to the banked coals that his grey fur sometimes carries a faint, permanent trace of wood smoke that Per finds, for reasons nobody has ever quite understood, deeply comforting to bury his face into whenever the dog allows it. 3 beds, 1 small room, and a particular accumulated warmth that comes not only from the earthen walls doing their slow, patient work, but from the simple, physical fact of 5 bodies and 1 aging dog, breathing quietly together through the long hours of a cold night, each one adding its own small measure of heat to a room that needs, by this late hour, remarkably little help at all to stay comfortable until morning. Morning in this house begins before the light does, which is simply the truth of a Swedish winter more than any particular virtue on Elin's part. She wakes first, most days, easing herself out from under the layers of wool bedding without disturbing Niels beside her, and her first task, every single morning without fail, is the fire. Not building it from nothing, which would be slow, unreliable work nobody wants to repeat daily, but coaxing it back up from the bed of embers she banked the night before, adding thin, dry kindling first, watching for the small orange thread of light that tells her the coals are still alive underneath their grey coat of ash. It usually takes her under a minute. Her hands know this task so completely that she could do it, and often does do it, while half asleep herself, her mind still somewhere in the last thread of a dream. Once the fire is drawing properly, she moves to the small alcove that serves as their kitchen, if kitchen is even the right word for a space no larger than a good-sized wardrobe, and begins the porridge that will feed all 5 of them. Oats simmered slowly with water, and, on good mornings, a splash of milk traded from a neighbouring farm the week before. This is not a quick task, and Elin does not treat it as one. She stirs it with the kind of patient, half-distracted attention you might give to something you have done 10,000 times, her mind wandering to the day ahead, even as her hand keeps moving in the same slow circle. Britta wakes next, most mornings, and her first job, assigned to her so long ago that nobody can actually remember deciding it, is to check on the small flock of hens the family keeps in a low shed, built into the same hillside just a few steps from the house, close enough that the hens benefit from the same earth-insulated warmth the family does. She gathers whatever eggs there are, rarely more than 2 or 3 this deep into winter when the hens lay sparingly, and she has developed the specific habit of warming each egg briefly between her palms before carrying it inside, not because it needs doing, but because she likes the way it feels, and 10 years old is exactly old enough to still get away with small, unnecessary tendernesses like that. Per is, without exception, the last one awake, and getting him moving each morning has become something of a quiet, ongoing negotiation between him and his grandmother, who has taken to threatening, in a tone far too gentle to actually be a threat, that she will eat his portion of porridge herself if he does not appear within a count of 20. She has never once actually eaten it. He has never once actually believed she would. And yet the game continues every single morning, both of them fully aware of the performance and neither willing to be the one who ends it. Niels, meanwhile, is usually already gone by the time full daylight arrives, off toward the charcoal mound he has been tending in the forest a mile or so from the house, a task that does not pause for weather or for family breakfast, because a charcoal burn once started cannot simply be left. This is the trade that keeps this household fed and clothed, and I want to spend a little time on it properly because it is a stranger, more demanding piece of work than most people picture when they hear the word charcoal. Charcoal burning in this era means building an enormous mound of carefully stacked wood, sometimes taller than a person and considerably wider, covering it in turf and earth to seal it nearly airtight, and then setting it smouldering rather than burning outright. A slow, controlled fire starved of oxygen that can take several days to complete its work, converting solid wood into the dense, purified fuel that iron forges across the region depend on entirely. The mound has to be watched constantly through this process, day and night, because too much air reaching the wood turns the whole careful structure into ash in an hour, undoing days of labour in the time it takes to notice the mistake. Niels sleeps beside his charcoal mounds during an active burn more nights than he sleeps in his own bed, in a small lean-to shelter built for exactly that purpose, checking the mound every few hours through the night by the particular colour and thinness of the smoke, rising from small vents he's cut into its earthen skin. It is solitary work, and hard on the body in ways that accumulate slowly, the smoke finding its way into a person's lungs and clothes, and the creases of their skin over years of doing this. And yet it pays reasonably well by the standards of families like theirs, well enough that Elin has not had to take in laundry from other households, the way some Backstuga wives do, well enough that Britta has a second dress, not just one, and well enough that they have never yet gone hungry through a Swedish winter, though a few winters have come uncomfortably close. The wider village does not quite know what to make of a family like this one, and Elin has made her peace with that a long time ago. Backstuga families sit in an odd, in-between spot in the social fabric of the countryside. Not servants exactly, since Niels answers to no single master and keeps the coin his charcoal earns, but not landholders either, not in any way the parish records would recognise, and that in-between status shows up in small, specific ways almost every week. At church on Sundays, the family that owns the land their hillside sits on occupies the front pews, as is expected, and Elin's family sits further back, not through any spoken rule, but through a settled, wordless understanding of where everyone belongs, the kind of arrangement nobody discusses because everybody already knows it. And yet there is a kind of respect underneath that arrangement too, one that took me a while researching this to properly appreciate. A family that can carve a warm, functioning home out of a rejected hillside that everyone else considered useless is not, in the eyes of most of the district, an object of pity. They are considered resourceful, clever with their hands, the kind of people a neighbour quietly asks for advice when their own root cellar keeps flooding, or their own turf roof keeps leaking. Niels has been called out more than once to look at a struggling farmer's drainage problem and tell them, in his unhurried way, exactly where the water is actually coming from, a skill nobody taught him formally, and everybody in a 2-mile radius now assumes he was simply born knowing. There is a piece of folklore tied to homes like theirs that I find myself thinking about often, and Morstina tells it to Per and Britta with a regularity that suggests she believes at least part of it herself, truly, even now, even after all these years. The old stories speak of Vitra, a kind of hidden people said to live underground, in the earth itself, invisible to human eyes most of the time but very much present, very much capable of taking offence, and very much deserving of a certain baseline courtesy from anyone whose home happened to be built into or against the same earth they occupied. You did not dig carelessly into a hillside without a word of acknowledgement first. You did not pour dirty water out onto bare ground after dark without a small warning called out ahead of it, in case anyone unseen happened to be passing beneath your feet at that exact moment. You kept your home reasonably tidy, reasonably respectful, on the theory that your underground neighbours noticed such things and remembered them. Whether Nils believes any of this the way his mother does is a question he tends to answer with a shrug and a small private smile rather than a real answer. But here is the thing I keep coming back to. He still calls out quietly, almost under his breath, before he pours the dishwater out each evening. He has done it every night for as long as Ellen has known him. Old habit, he calls it, when she teases him about it. Cheap insurance, he calls it another time, laughing. But he does it every single night regardless. And there is something in that small, private, unexplained ritual that I find worth sitting with for a moment before we move on. Let me tell you about food in this house, because it is not the thin, grim fare you might be picturing when you hear the word poverty attached to a family like this one, and I want to correct that picture properly before we go further. The midday meal, the heaviest of the day, most often centers on a thick soup, potatoes and whatever root vegetables the family managed to store through autumn, carrots and turnips mostly, simmered for hours in a pot that hangs from an iron arm swung out over the fire, along with a portion of salted pork when they have it, which is more often than you might expect, since Nils trades charcoal for a share of a neighbouring farm's autumn slaughter most years, an arrangement that has held steady for nearly a decade now. Rye bread, dense and dark and faintly sour, gets baked in batches large enough to last 2 or 3 weeks at a stretch, the loaves hung to dry from a wooden pole near the ceiling in flat rings with a hole punched through the centre of each one, an old, practical method that keeps mice away and keeps the bread from moulding in the damp winter air. You break a piece off as needed, softening it in the soup if it has gone too hard to chew comfortably, and there is a particular satisfaction in that dry, sour bread against a hot broth that Ellen has never quite managed to explain to anyone who did not grow up eating it the same way. In summer, the table changes entirely, and this is a shift worth pausing on properly, because it says something about how differently a household like theirs experienced the 2 halves of the year. Fresh milk arrives daily instead of being rationed carefully from what little survived the winter. Wild berries, lingonberries especially, and later in the season blueberries gathered from the forest floor within sight of their own roof, sweeten a meal that spent months tasting mostly of salt and grain. Fish, when Nils has an hour to spare at the small lake half a mile down the slope, adds a lightness to the table that winter simply cannot offer no matter how well stocked the root cellar happens to be. Meals are eaten together, all 5 of them, seated on low stools around a table barely large enough for the purpose, and there is a particular quiet that settles over this specific half hour of the day that I want you to notice, because it is different from the quiet of any other moment in their routine. Nobody rushes it. Even Per, who rushes nearly everything else in his 6-year-old life, slows down at this table, partly because Stina insists on it with a single raised eyebrow that requires no words at all, and partly, I suspect, because some part of even a 6-year-old body understands that this is the one stretch of the day when the whole family occupies the same small space at the same unhurried pace. And there is something in a child that recognizes the value of that, even without having language for it yet. Let me slow down here for a while because I want to spend real time on the shape of a full year in this house, not just a single day of it, and how differently the same 4 walls feel depending on the season pressing in against them from outside. Spring arrives late this far north, later than you might expect if your own idea of spring comes from somewhere further south, and it arrives loudly, the sound of meltwater running in small, urgent streams down the slope above their house. A sound Ellen has come to associate so completely with the turning of the year that she claims, only half joking, that she can tell the exact week of the thaw with her eyes closed, just from the particular pitch of the water finding its way past her drainage channel. This is the season Nils reserves for repairs, checking the roof for winter damage, patching moss into any gap the frost has worked loose over the coldest months. And it is also, not coincidentally, the season Stina's joints ache the worst, the damp cold of thawing ground working its way into her hands in a manner she describes, without much patience for sympathy, as the earth collecting on an old debt. Summer is short and it is precious, and everyone in this household treats it that way without needing to be told. This is haymaking season, and it pulls the entire family, Britta and even young Per included, out into the meadow a farmer 2 hillsides over lets them use in exchange for a portion of the cut hay which the family needs for their own goat and the small flock of hens through the coming winter. It is exhausting work, scything and turning and stacking hay under a sun that, this far north, refuses to properly set for weeks at a stretch, the sky staying a pale, glowing grey even at midnight. And Ellen has told me, or told the version of this story I am telling you tonight, that there is something almost dizzying about a summer where night barely arrives at all, where a person's body keeps expecting the dark to come and it simply does not. Autumn is harvest and preparation, potatoes dug and stored, the last of the rye brought in, mushrooms gathered from the forest floor in the specific brief window when the ground is damp enough to bring them up, but not yet cold enough to end the season entirely. And this is Britta's favourite task of the whole year, if you asked her, though she would probably deny having a favourite at all if you asked her directly. The particular pleasure of finding a cluster of chanterelles half hidden under fallen leaves being something she has never quite managed to explain to anyone, least of all herself. And then winter, which is the season this house was truly built for. The season where every choice Nils's father and grandfather made about drainage and turf and earth packed thick against 3 walls proves its worth all at once. The days shrink down to a few pale hours of proper light, and the family's whole rhythm compresses inward around the fire. Work continuing, always continuing, but slower now, quieter, more of it happening with hands occupied and voices low, mending and spinning and small repairs that summer never leaves time for. This is the season for more Stina's stories, told at length now rather than in the brief snatches summer allows. And it is the season too when the earth walls of a Backstugor do the one thing no ordinary timber house built entirely above ground could ever quite manage, holding a steady, patient warmth through nights so cold that Ellen has heard more than once of livestock freezing in barns built the conventional way, walls and all, while her own family slept warm enough most nights to leave a single blanket folded unused at the foot of the bed. I want to tell you now about the particular shape of this family, the quiet architecture of who they are to each other, because a house is only ever half the story, and the people inside it are the other half, the half that actually matters most. Ellen and Nils have been married for 12 years now, and theirs was not, by the standards of their district, a particularly romantic beginning. Marriages among families like theirs were arranged as much by practicality as by feeling, 2 people whose circumstances fit together reasonably well, whose families knew each other, whose temperaments seemed unlikely to clash too badly over a shared lifetime. And yet something did grow between them over these 12 years that neither of them expected going in. A kind of steady, unshowy affection that shows itself less in words than in small daily gestures neither of them would think to call romantic at all. Nils splits kindling into pieces slightly smaller than strictly necessary because he noticed years ago that Ellen's hands are smaller than his and struggle with the larger logs. Ellen keeps his second shirt mended and ready before the first one wears through, not because he ever asks her to, but because she likes, in some quiet way she has never examined too closely, being the reason he is never caught short. They argue sometimes, as any 2 people sharing one small room for 12 years inevitably will. though the arguments in this house tend to be brief and practical rather than dramatic. Disagreements about whether the goat needs a second rope or whether Per is old enough yet to be trusted alone near the charcoal mound, which he is absolutely not, according to Ellen, and which Nils privately suspects might be true in another year or two, though he is wise enough by now never to say so out loud. Britta and Per fight the way siblings 4 years apart in age generally fight, which is to say constantly and without much real malice behind any of it. She finds him exhausting in the specific way older siblings find younger ones exhausting, a small shadow that follows her everywhere and asks why about everything. And yet she is also, without quite admitting it to herself, fiercely protective of him in a manner that surfaces mostly when someone outside the family says something unkind about either of them. A boy from a neighbouring farm mocked Per once last autumn for the patched knee of his trousers, and Britta, 10 years old and half his size, walked directly up to him and informed him with total icy calm that his own trousers had been patched twice as many times, which was not even remotely true, but which shut the boy up so thoroughly that he has not said a word to either of them since. More, Stina occupies the quiet, essential position that grandmothers seem to occupy in households like this one across every century and every country I have ever researched, holding a kind of authority that has nothing to do with formal power and everything to do with accumulated memory. She remembers which winters were hardest and what got them through. She remembers with an accuracy that unsettles Ellen sometimes exactly which herbs eased Per's cough as an infant and exactly how much honey it takes to make the bitterest of them tolerable to a small child's mouth. She spins wool nearly every waking hour these days, her hands moving almost without her attention the way a familiar prayer might move through someone's mouth without conscious thought, and she has, over the years, become the household's unofficial keeper of every small piece of practical wisdom nobody ever bothered to write down, because she has simply always been there to say it out loud when it was needed. There is something Elin has never told Nils, not fully, not in 12 years of marriage, and I want to share it with you gently, the way she might share it herself if the right quiet evening ever came along and the words finally found their way out. Before Britta there was another child, a daughter born 3 years into the marriage who lived for 11 days and then did not. Ellen does not speak of her often, and when she does it is in careful sideways references that Nils has learned to recognise and honour without pressing further, a particular tightening around her eyes when a certain kind of spring light falls a certain way across the floor, close to the anniversary of a date neither of them says aloud anymore. She was going to be called Ingrid, after Ellen's own mother, and there is a small smooth stone Ellen keeps wrapped in a scrap of linen at the very bottom of the household's one wooden chest gathered from the riverbank the week Ingrid was born, that nobody else in the family knows exists. I do not tell you this to make the evening heavier than it needs to be. I tell you because I think there is something true in it about the particular kind of quiet strength a woman like Ellen carries. A private grief folded small and kept close for over a decade, never announced, never fully closed either, simply carried alongside everything else a full life asks a person to carry. She does not perform sadness about it, and she has never once let it dim the fierce, steady warmth she gives to Britta and Per. But it is there underneath, the way a single stone at the bottom of a chest is there, unseen most days, weighing almost nothing at all, and yet never quite forgotten either. Nils suspects more than he lets on. He has never once opened that chest to look, not out of lack of curiosity, but out of a particular kind of respect he has never quite put words to, an understanding that some things are hers alone to carry, hers alone to decide whether or when to share, and that his job, quietly, is simply to be there beside her regardless, whether she ever tells him the whole of it or not. Let me bring you back into the room now, back into the present evening, because there is a particular sound approaching outside that I want you to notice before I tell you what it is. Footsteps, crunching lightly through the thin crust of snow, coming down the narrow path that connects their hillside to the wider track leading toward the village proper. It is a neighbour, a widow named Ingeborg, who lives alone in a smaller Backstuga perhaps a mile further along the same ridge, and she visits perhaps twice a month through the winter. Always around this hour, always with some small excuse, a jar of preserved lingonberry she claims to have too many of, a question about whether Nils might spare an hour next week to look at her own troublesome roof. The excuses are thin, and everyone involved understands they are thin, and nobody minds at all, because the actual reason for the visit is simpler than any of the stated ones. Ingeborg is alone through the long winter nights in a way this household is not, and a short walk through the cold to sit by someone else's fire for half an hour is worth considerably more to her than any jar of preserves. Ellen puts the kettle on the moment she hears the footsteps without needing to be asked, and there is a particular warmth to these visits that I find myself drawn to describing. The easy, unhurried talk of two women who have known each other most of their lives, conversation drifting from the price of salt at the last market to whose hens have started laying again to a piece of village gossip neither of them entirely believes but both enjoy repeating anyway. Her, delighted at any interruption to the evening's usual quiet, performs some small trick for Ingeborg's benefit, a somersault attempted with more enthusiasm than skill, and Britta rolls her eyes in the specific theatrical way only a 10-year-old sibling can manage, though she is smiling while she does it. Once Ingeborg has gone, ushered out with a small parcel of dried mushrooms pressed into her hands whether she wanted them or not, the house settles back into its ordinary evening rhythm, and this is Per's favourite part of the day, though he would be embarrassed to hear it described that way. More Stina's stories. She does not tell them every night, and there is no fixed hour when they begin, no ritual announcement. They simply arrive, the way weather arrives, when her spinning slows and her eyes go somewhere distant, and Per, sensing it before anyone else does, abandons whatever small task he was half-heartedly pretending to help with, and settles onto the floor near her feet. Britta pretends most nights to be too old for this, occupying herself with some other small chore across the room, and yet she is always, without fail, positioned close enough to hear every word. Tonight the story is about the Vitra again, though never told quite the same way twice, and this particular version concerns a farmer 2 generations back who dug a new root cellar without first asking permission of whoever might already be living in that particular patch of earth, and who found every single morning for a week afterward his tools moved a few feet from where he had left them, nothing broken, nothing stolen, simply shifted deliberately as if to say we noticed. He apologized properly on the 8th morning, left a small offering of milk at the cellar entrance the old way, and the tools stopped moving after that. More Stina tells this one with total conviction, and Per listens with the particular wide-eyed stillness he almost never manages during church, and Britta, despite every effort to appear unmoved, glances once toward the darkened corner near their own root cellar door before catching herself and looking quickly away. I find these old stories worth taking seriously, not necessarily as literal fact, but as something else entirely, a kind of inherited etiquette toward the land itself, a habit of humility passed down through story rather than through instruction, teaching each generation to move carefully, to ask rather than assume, to leave a small offering of respect for whatever they could not see or fully understand about the ground beneath their own home. There is something almost modern in that, if you think about it for a moment. A family living half inside the earth, being taught generation after generation not to take that earth entirely for granted. There are other stories too, ones more Stina tells less often, quieter ones, about the particular quality of silence that falls over a forest just before snow, which she insists is a different silence entirely from an ordinary cold, still evening, and about a light sometimes seen moving low across the bog on certain autumn nights that older folk call by a name Ellen will not repeat in front of the children, out of what she describes, when pressed, as simple caution rather than actual belief. Whether she believes it herself is a question she has never quite answered directly, not even to herself, I suspect. Let me tell you about the work Elin's own hands do through these long winter evenings, because it is a craft in its own right, and one I think deserves more attention than it usually gets. She weaves on a narrow loom set up in the corner of the room nearest what little window light remains by late afternoon, producing the coarse woolen cloth that clothes most of the household through the year, dyed in muted, earthy colours made from plants she gathers and prepares herself across the warmer months. Birch leaves for a soft yellow, alder bark for a deep warm brown, and for the rare occasions she wants something closer to red, a lichen gathered from specific rocks on the ridge above their home that takes weeks of careful preparation to yield colour at all. This is slow, exacting work, each pass of the shuttle a small, repeated motion that Elin has performed so many thousands of times that her hands have grown a kind of independent intelligence, capable of continuing the pattern correctly even while her attention wanders somewhere else entirely, toward the coming week's tasks, toward a half-remembered tune, toward nothing in particular at all. Britta is learning this craft too, slowly, her small hands still clumsy at the parts that require real precision, the tension of the warp threads, the even steady pressure of each pass. But she is improving, and Elin has begun, this past year, to let her complete entire small sections on her own, checking the work afterward with a critical eye that has softened considerably over the months as Britta's own skill has grown. There is a particular pride Elin feels watching her daughter's hands move across the loom with growing confidence, a pride she has never quite said out loud, though I suspect Britta knows it anyway, the way children often know these things without needing the words spoken directly. Knitting fills the smaller gaps of time that weaving cannot. The stray 20 minutes here and there through a busy day, socks and mittens produced almost without conscious effort, Elin's needles clicking steadily while she minds the fire or watches Per attempt some new small mischief. Nils's hands, when they are not busy with the charcoal mound or the roof or the drainage channel, turn to carving, small practical objects mostly, spoons and bowls, and, once, a small wooden horse for Per's 5th birthday that the boy still keeps, though he would deny, at 6, still caring about it quite as much as he does. There is a game Per and Britta play most winter evenings, once chores are done and before the household properly settles for the night, that has been passed down through enough generations of children in this district that nobody remembers who invented it, or whether anyone invented it at all rather than it simply accreting piece by piece the way folk games tend to. It involves a set of small carved sticks, 5 of them, tossed and caught on the back of the hand in a sequence of increasing difficulty, and Britta, despite 4 years of practice advantage over her brother, still loses to him roughly a third of the time, a fact that irritates her considerably more than it probably should, given that Per's success seems to come almost entirely from a stubborn refusal to accept defeat rather than any particular skill. More Stina keeps score some evenings, not because either child particularly needs a scorekeeper, but because being asked to keep score makes her feel included in a game her own joints no longer allow her to attempt herself, and there is a specific, quiet look that crosses her face on the evenings nobody thinks to ask. A small deflation she covers quickly and would never mention, though Elin has learnt to notice it and has taken, this past year, to asking every single time regardless whether the children remember to or not. Health, in a household like this one, is managed almost entirely at home, and Elin, like Edith in a different century and a different country entirely, though she has never heard of Edith and never will, has accumulated a working knowledge of the illnesses her family is likely to face and what actually helps against them, learned from her own mother and refined through years of trial across 5 people sharing one small room through long winters where illness, once it arrives, has nowhere to go and nobody to avoid. A cough gets a warm compress of steeped pine needles pressed against the chest. A stomach upset gets a tea of dried chamomile gathered in summer from the meadow edge and hung to dry alongside the season's mushrooms. The fever gets careful watching, cool cloths, and the particular patient vigilance that comes from having already lost one child and being determined in the quiet, unspoken way that determination like that usually operates, never to lose another. The nearest thing to a doctor lives most of a day's travel away, in the small town where the parish church also stands, and is reserved, by unspoken agreement across the whole district, for genuine emergencies rather than the ordinary aches and fevers that pass through a household like weather. A broken bone once, 3 years back, when Nils slipped carrying wood down an icy slope, warranted the journey. A child's persistent cough generally does not unless it worsens past what Ilin's own accumulated knowledge can manage, and so far, touch wood, it never quite has. Once or twice a month, weather permitting, Elin makes the journey into the village proper, a walk of just under an hour along a track that Nils keeps reasonably clear through the worst of the winter, carrying whatever the household has to trade, a length of her own woven cloth, a portion of dried mushrooms, occasionally a small carved bowl from Nils's own hands when he has had time enough to make more than the family strictly needs. Market day is not a large affair, nothing like the grand markets you might picture from a city further south, simply a modest gathering of farmers and craftspeople, and a handful of travelling merchants setting up along the single wide street that fronts the church. But it is for Elin one of the few regular occasions to see faces beyond her own small household and Ingeborg's occasional visits, and she treats the walk there and back as something close to a private luxury, an hour each way, with nobody's needs to attend to but her own thoughts. She trades carefully, having learned over the years exactly what her cloth is worth, and exactly which merchants try to offer less than that worth to anyone who looks uncertain. And she has become in her own quiet way rather sharp at this particular negotiation, a fact that would probably surprise anyone who only ever saw her at home moving gently and unhurriedly through her daily tasks. There is a version of Elin that exists only at market, briefly, a version with a harder edge and a quicker tongue. And I find that duality rather wonderful to sit with, the idea that a person can hold two entirely different postures toward the world depending on which world they happen to be standing in. Elin usually returns with something small for each of the children, not always, and never anything expensive. A striped ribbon for Britta's hair one month, a small paper twist of actual sugar for Per another month, a rare treat sweet enough that he makes it last nearly a week, doling tiny portions out to himself with a self-control that surprises everyone who knows how little self-control he generally shows about anything else. Midsummer is the one night of the year this household allows itself something close to true celebration, and I want to spend proper time on it, because the contrast against the quiet, work-bound rhythm of the rest of the year makes it feel even now, even generations removed from it, remarkably special to imagine. The whole district gathers at a meadow near the largest farm in the parish, a maypole raised and dressed with birch branches and whatever early summer flowers can be gathered in time. And there is dancing that goes on for hours under a sky that this far north never actually darkens, the sun simply dipping low toward the horizon and holding there, refusing to properly set, casting a long golden light across the whole gathering that Elin has described, in the version of this story passed down through her own family, as looking almost like the whole world was holding its breath in the middle of something it did not want to end. Britta, at 10, is old enough now to join the older children's circle dances properly rather than being shepherded through the simpler steps reserved for the very young, and this is the first year she has managed the full sequence without a single stumble, a small private triumph she mentions to her mother at least 4 separate times over the following week, unable to quite let the pride of it go. Per spends most of the evening chasing other boys his own age through the meadow grass in some elaborate game with rules that change every few minutes and that none of the adults watching could possibly explain, though all of them recognize the particular unbridled joy of it, having once, a very long time ago, played some version of the same nameless running game themselves. There is food too, more of it and richer than any ordinary evening, herring prepared several different ways, the first new potatoes of the season, small and sweet, boiled with dill gathered that same morning, and strawberries, the very first of them, wild and small and intensely flavoured in a way Ellen insists no cultivated berry has ever matched. Nils, for one single night a year, sets aside the quiet, careful reserve that defines him through the rest of the calendar and dances properly with his wife in front of the whole gathered district, a fact that Ellen brings up, teasing him gently at unexpected moments throughout the following months, watching him go faintly, thoroughly embarrassed every single time. Christmas, or Yule, arrives at the opposite extreme of the year, in the deepest, darkest stretch of winter, and it carries a completely different weight, quieter, more inward, centered entirely around this one small house rather than the wider gathered district. Preparations begin weeks ahead, Ellen baking special breads and small sweet cakes flavored with precious, carefully hoarded spices bought specifically for this one occasion, saffron most treasured of all, its golden color and particular fragrance saved for exactly one batch of small buns each year, a single indulgence stretched as far as it will possibly go. A special sheaf of grain, set aside deliberately from the autumn harvest rather than milled with the rest, gets tied up and placed outside on a pole near the door on Christmas morning, an offering for the birds through the hardest stretch of winter, a tradition Stina insists on with total seriousness, describing it not as charity exactly, but as a kind of quiet gratitude owed back to the land and the creatures on it for another year survived. Candles burn more freely this one week than any other, a small extravagance the household allows itself, and the whole house takes on, for these few days, a warmth and brightness that stands in gentle, deliberate contrast to the long dark pressing in against the small window outside. There is one more tradition worth telling you about before we settle deeper into the quiet of tonight, and it is one that touches directly on sleep itself, which feels fitting given the hour. Roughly once a week, sometimes more often in the depths of winter when the cold demands it, the family visits the small bathhouse a short walk from their own door, a simple timber structure shared with two neighbouring households, heated by a stone stove that takes the better part of an afternoon to bring up to full heat. This is not a quick errand, it is a proper occasion, water heated and poured over hot stones until the small room fills with a dense enveloping steam, and the whole family sits together in that heat, skin flushed, breathing slow and deep, in a silence that feels entirely different from any other silence in their week, unhurried in a way that even their evening fireside hour rarely manages. Afterward, they step outside briefly, even in the depths of winter, even with snow on the ground, the shock of cold air against heated skin producing a particular gasping, laughing exhilaration that Per especially loves, shrieking every single time as though it were a genuine surprise despite having done exactly this every week of his short life, and then back inside, wrapped quickly in linen, skin still glowing, and it is on bath nights, without exception, that this entire household falls asleep faster and more completely than on any other night of the week. Bodies loose and warm and thoroughly, deeply relaxed in a way that ordinary rest never quite achieves. I mention this because I think there is something worth noticing in how deliberately this family built rest into their week, not as an afterthought, not as whatever time happened to be left over once the real work was done, but as its own small, protected ritual, tended and repeated with the same seriousness they gave to the charcoal mound or the drainage channel. Rest mattered to them. It was not indulgence. It was maintenance, the same as anything else that kept a household running through a long, demanding year, and I find something quietly instructive in that, something worth carrying with you as your own evening winds down tonight. Let me take you back a little further now, before this particular evening, before even Britta and Per existed, to the way Nils himself came to this house and this trade, because I think it deepens everything you have heard so far. He grew up in this exact Backstuga, the same low ceiling, the same drainage channel, though it was his father who dug it originally, decades before Nils ever picked up a spade of his own. His father was a charcoal burner too, and his father before him, the trade passed down the way a family recipe or a particular fold of prayer gets passed down. not through formal teaching so much as simple, constant proximity, a boy watching his father tend a mound through countless nights until the knowledge settled into his own hands almost without him noticing it arrive. Nils remembers, with a clarity that surprises him sometimes, the first time his father let him check a mound's smoke alone, 11 years old, terrified of getting it wrong, standing in the dark forest at an hour no 11-year-old should reasonably be awake, and the small fierce pride that flooded through him when his father looked at his description of the smoke's colour afterward and simply nodded once and said nothing more, because nothing more needed saying. His mother, the woman you know now as Mor Stina, ran this household for decades before Ellen ever arrived to take up that same work, and there was a period, brief and never discussed openly, when the two women's roles overlapped uncomfortably, the young bride and the established mother both reaching for the same tasks, the same authority over the same small kitchen. It resolved itself the way these things generally do, slowly, without any single dramatic conversation, Stina gradually stepping back as her joints made the physical work harder anyway, and Ellen gradually stepping forward, until one day neither of them could quite say when, the transfer had simply completed itself, and Stina found a new, equally essential role in the stories and the wisdom and the quiet keeping of memory that the household still leans on constantly. Nils inherited the house itself the way Backstuga families generally passed such things down. An informal arrangement with the landholder renewed each generation rather than any formal deed. A continuity of use rather than ownership in the way you might understand ownership. It is, if you sit with it for a moment, a strange kind of permanence built on something that was never actually permanent at all. A family rooted for 3 generations now in a hillside they have never once legally owned, and yet rooted all the same, in every way that has ever actually mattered to the people living there. Outside, right now, in the particular evening we have been sitting inside of together this whole time, snow has started falling again, the kind that falls without wind behind it, straight down, steady, the sort of snowfall that will leave a clean, thick blanket over everything by morning rather than the sharp, drifted kind that makes Nils's walk to the charcoal mound a genuine struggle. You can hear it if you listen closely enough, or rather you can hear the particular hush it creates, a deepening of the ordinary nighttime quiet, sound itself seeming to travel less far once enough snow has settled over the forest floor and the roof and the whole sloping hillside this house is built into. A mile along the ridge, in her own smaller Backstuga, Ingeborg is likely settling into her own bed right about now, alone, the way she has been alone for the 6 years since her husband died of a fever that took him faster than anyone expected, faster than any of Ellen's careful home remedies could have addressed even if they had reached her in time. I think of her sometimes in these quiet hours, and I hope you will too, just for a moment, one woman alone in her own small warm room built into her own small patch of hillside, managing entirely on her own the things this household manages between 5 people, and doing it, by every account anyone in the district will give you, with a steadiness and quiet dignity that never once asks for the pity people sometimes want to offer her anyway. Back in Ellen and Nils' house, the evening is winding down now in earnest. Per has finally, properly stopped resisting sleep, curled on his low bed near the fire with the particular boneless, total collapse that only very young children manage, one arm flung above his head, mouth slightly open, entirely unbothered by the world. Britta reads for a few more minutes by the last of the firelight, one of the family's small handful of books, a collection of psalms mostly, though she has read it so many times she is not really reading anymore so much as reciting quietly along, before her own eyes grow too heavy to continue, and she sets it aside without quite finishing the page she was on. Morstina's spinning slows and stops for the night, the wheel falling still, and she sits for a while longer in the settling quiet, watching the fire the way she has watched 10,000 fires before this one, before she too rises, slowly, joints protesting the movement the way they protest every movement now, and makes her way to her own corner of the room, her own bed built low against the earthen wall where the warmth gathers thickest. Aylin banks the fire last, the same practiced motion she performs every night, raking the coals into a careful mound and covering them with a fine layer of ash that will hold them smouldering quietly until morning without ever quite going out. The same fire, in a sense, that has been burning in this hearth for 3 generations now, never once fully extinguished, simply banked down and coaxed back up, over and over, decade after decade. She sits for a moment afterward, alone, in the low orange glow that remains, and this is the part of her day she treats as most entirely her own, 5 or 10 minutes where nobody needs anything from her, where the only sound is the faint tick and settle of the cooling fire and the soft, steady breathing of her family around her in the dark. I think there is something worth noticing in this small habit of hers, the way she claims this brief window for herself night after night without ever announcing it as anything special, a private ritual of stillness tucked into the very end of a day otherwise given entirely to other people. The walls around her, at this hour, are doing exactly what they were built to do. If you could press your palm flat against the earthen side of this house right now, the wall that backs directly into the hillside, you would find it neither cold nor especially warm, but steady, holding a temperature that has barely shifted since this afternoon and will barely shift again before morning, the deep, patient thermal mass of packed earth and stone doing its slow, invisible work regardless of whether anyone in the house is awake to appreciate it. This is the whole quiet genius of a Backstugor distilled down to this single sensation, this single unremarkable moment of a mother sitting alone by a banked fire in a room that refuses to grow properly cold no matter how far the temperature outside has already fallen. Nils joins her after a few minutes, having checked the door latch and the small window shutter out of the same habit he checks the charcoal mound, thorough, unhurried, and they sit together for a while without much need for words, her head eventually finding his shoulder, his arms settling around her without either of them quite deciding to move that way, simply arriving there the way 2 bodies that have shared one small room for 12 years tend to arrive at these positions without conscious thought. This is the hour, more than any other in their whole day, when the 2 of them talk properly, quietly, about whatever needs discussing away from the children's ears. Tonight a small worry about whether the potato store will stretch through to spring the way it has most years, though Ellen has already done the careful mental arithmetic 3 separate times this week and believes cautiously that it will. Nils listens, nods, adds his own quieter calculation about what the next charcoal delivery might bring in trade, and between the 2 of them, in this soft, low-voiced exchange, the shape of the coming weeks gets settled, the way it gets settled most nights, not through any formal decision but through this same easy accumulated back and forth. I want to take you out into the forest for a while now, away from the house, to a night some weeks back when Nils was tending an active burn, because I think it rounds out the picture of this family in a way that staying inside the house all evening cannot quite manage on its own. The charcoal mound sat in a small clearing he and his father had used for this exact purpose for as long as anyone in the family could remember. The ground around it packed hard and bare from decades of the same fires built in the same spot, and on this particular night the cold had settled in hard enough that even the lean-to shelter, with its small warming fire built just outside the entrance, required Nils to keep moving every so often simply to hold the feeling in his fingers. He does not mind this the way you might expect. There is a particular kind of solitude out here that he has come to value over the years, different from the busy peopled warmth of the house, quieter, cleaner somehow, just him and the slow, patient work of the mound and the enormous dark of the forest stretching away in every direction. He checked the vents every 2 hours through the night, a ritual as precise and unvarying as Ellen's morning fire, crouching low beside each small opening cut into the mound's earthen skin, reading the smoke by colour and thickness in a language he has never had to explain to anyone because everyone who needed to know it already knew it the same way, learnt the same slow way, watching a father do it 1,000 times before ever being trusted to do it himself. Thin, pale blue smoke meant the burn was proceeding correctly, patient and controlled. A shift toward white, thicker smoke meant too much moisture escaping too fast and warranted a small adjustment, a patch of fresh turf pressed carefully over a section of the mound's skin to slow the draw. Nils has made this exact adjustment so many times across so many years that his hands know the correct pressure without his mind needing to calculate it at all. Somewhere around the middle of the night, another charcoal burner from a neighbouring stretch of forest, a man named Eric, whom Nils has known his whole life, wandered over from his own mound a short walk away, as the two of them do most nights when their burns happen to overlap, sharing the last of a flask of something warm and sitting together for a while in a companionable quiet that needed almost no conversation to sustain itself. This is one of the genuine, unadvertised pleasures of a trade that looks from the outside purely solitary. The forest at night, across this whole district, holds a scattered handful of men doing exactly this same patient work at exactly the same hour, and there is a real, if quiet, camaraderie among them, built across years of these same shared wordless nights. By the time the eastern sky had begun its slow grey lightening, Nils had checked the vents perhaps 6 or 7 times since midnight, and the burn was proceeding exactly as it should. 3 more days of careful watching ahead of it before the mound could be opened and the finished charcoal raked out and loaded for the journey to the ironworks that would pay him for weeks of this patient, solitary labour. He walked home briefly at dawn, as he does during every extended burn, not to rest properly, there is rarely time enough for that, but simply to see his family for the length of one breakfast before returning to the forest. And I find something quietly moving in that, a man willing to trade a full night's sleep over and over for one shared bowl of porridge with the people he loves most. Once a year in early autumn, Nils makes a rather more formal walk than his usual trips to the charcoal mound, up to the main farmhouse whose land their hillside technically belongs to settle the year's accounting with the farmer who holds it, a broad, unhurried man named Olof, whose own father struck the original arrangement with Nils's grandfather decades back. This meeting carries a particular weight neither man treats lightly, though it rarely takes more than half an hour, a reckoning of labour owed and labour given across the past year, days Nils spent helping with Olof's own harvest, weighed against the rent implied by the small, unwanted patch of hillside his family has occupied now for 3 generations. It is not always an entirely comfortable conversation. There have been leaner years, a bad harvest on Olof's side or a slow season for charcoal on Nils's, when the balance did not settle quite as evenly as either man would prefer, and the negotiation in those years has required a patience and a careful, respectful firmness on Nils's part that I think says something true about the quiet skill required to hold a place like this, precarious in its legal footing, secure only through the accumulated goodwill and mutual reliance of 2 families who have simply needed each other, generation after generation, regardless of what any formal document does or does not say. This year, though, the reckoning went easily, the summer's haymaking labour and a particularly strong charcoal season balancing out neatly, and Olof, who is not a man given to excessive warmth, nonetheless pressed a small extra measure of grain into Nils's hands at the end of their conversation, calling it nothing more than thanks for the roof advice given freely to 3 different struggling neighbours this past spring, though both men understood it as something closer to genuine respect, however awkwardly expressed. The wider village holds other figures worth knowing too. Briefly, the people who move through the edges of this family's world without occupying its centre. There is Anders the blacksmith, whose forge depends entirely on charcoal, like the kind Nils produces, and whose gruff, economical manner conceals, according to Ellen at least, a genuine soft spot for Britta, who he has taught, over several visits, the rudiments of working a small hand bellows, delighted every time by her fierce concentration. There is the parish priest, a mild, aging man named Pastor Lindquist, who has held this small congregation for over 30 years, and who married Ellen and Nils himself, and who still, every single Sunday, makes a point of greeting this family personally despite their seats being well toward the back of the church, a small, consistent kindness that Ellen has never forgotten. And there is Kaiser, the district's midwife, who delivered both Britta and Per, and who sat with Ellen, silent and steady, through the 11 days of Ingrid's short life and the days that followed, a debt of quiet gratitude Ellen has never quite found the words to properly repay, though Kaiser has never once seemed to expect repayment of any kind. There was a winter 4 years back now that this family still refers to quietly simply as the hard one, when an early frost destroyed a good portion of the district's potato harvest, and Per, then only 2 years old, came down with a fever that climbed high enough on its second night that Ilin sat up beside him hour after hour, cool cloths and steeped chamomile, and a fear she has never fully described to anyone, not even Nils, though he sat up with her regardless, silent, present, unable to do much of anything except be there. The fever broke on the third morning, the way fevers often do, suddenly and without warning, Per waking pale and weak but unmistakably himself again, asking in a small cracked voice whether there was porridge, a question so ordinary and so entirely him that Elin, by her own later account, sat down on the floor beside his bed and simply cried for several minutes before she could bring herself to answer him. I tell you this not to frighten you tonight, but because I think it matters, when picturing a family like this one, to understand that their steadiness was not the absence of fear. It was fear met and carried and worked through over and over, the same as it is for any family in any century, and the warmth of the life we have spent tonight inside of was built, in part, directly on top of nights exactly like that one. That same shortage meant careful, deliberate rationing through the following months, meals stretched thinner than usual, and Ellen has told the story since more than once of walking to Ingeborg's smaller Backstuga one particularly lean week with a portion of their own dwindling store because Ingeborg, alone, had even less cushion than a family of 5 sharing resources 5 ways, and receiving, a month later, once Ingeborg's own small garden began producing again in spring, an equally generous return more than had originally been given, pressed on Ellen with a firmness that left no room for polite refusal. This, more than almost anything else I have researched about households like this one, feels like the true engine that kept families through winters like that. Not self-sufficiency exactly, though there was plenty of that too, but a wider, quieter web of mutual obligation stretched across an entire hillside of neighbours who understood, without ever needing to say it aloud, that any one of them might need exactly this kind of help themselves someday, and that the ledger of who owed what to whom was never actually the point. Let me pull back a little now, away from this one family for just a moment, and give you a broader view of how homes like theirs fit into the larger sweep of Swedish history, because I think it adds something worth having before we settle back in for the rest of the night. Backstugor of this kind reached their greatest number sometime around the middle of the 1800s, a period when Sweden's rural population had grown considerably faster than the available farmland could comfortably absorb, and the class of people living in homes like Ellen and Nils's generally called Backstugasittare, meaning roughly those who sit in a Backstuga, made up a considerable portion of the countryside's population by that point. Considerably more than most people today would guess. They were not a marginal curiosity. In many parishes, families living in earth-sheltered cottages like this one accounted for something close to a quarter of the local population, a whole hidden layer of rural life tucked into hillsides and forest edges across the country, doing the charcoal burning and day labour and small trades that the wider agricultural economy quietly depended on without ever quite crediting properly. The decline came later in the century and into the next, as industrialization opened new kinds of work in growing towns and cities, as emigration, particularly toward North America, drew away a significant portion of exactly the population that had once filled homes like this one, and as changes in land law gradually made it easier, over generations, for more people to hold small parcels of land in their own right rather than through informal arrangements like the one Nils's family has held for 3 generations. By the early 1900s, the Backstuga as a common, everyday kind of home was already fading, and by the middle of that century most had been abandoned entirely, left to slowly return to the hillsides that had always, in one earthen wall at least, half belonged to them anyway. A number of them survive today, preserved deliberately at open-air museums scattered across the Swedish countryside, places where you can walk in the present day into a room very much like the one we have spent tonight inside of, low-ceilinged, earth-walled, built with exactly the same patient understanding of drainage and insulation that kept a family like Elin's warm through 150 winters' worth of Swedish cold. Visitors sometimes remark apparently on how much smaller these homes feel than they expected, and how much warmer too, a small quiet correction to whatever grim picture they had been carrying in their heads before they ducked through that low doorway themselves. I find something rather lovely in that continued existence, honestly. A way of living built by people with very little formal claim to anything, on land nobody else particularly wanted, preserved now, generations later, not as a monument to hardship, but as a genuine, admired example of quiet ingenuity. People who looked at an unwanted hillside and saw, correctly, exactly the kind of shelter it could become. The goat living on their roof, incidentally, has a name, though it is not a particularly dignified one. Per named her when he was 4, insisting with total 4-year-old confidence that she was called Lingon, after the berries she seems to prefer above all other forage, and the name stuck so completely that even Nils, who initially found the whole business faintly ridiculous, now uses it without a second thought. Lingon is by all accounts a creature of considerable personality, prone to a specific stubbornness about which corner of the roof she prefers to graze depending on the angle of the afternoon sun, and truly attached, in whatever way goats manage attachment, to Britta specifically, following her around the small yard with an insistence that the rest of the family finds endlessly amusing and Britta pretends, without much conviction, to find slightly embarrassing. Hens, on the other hand, have no names at all, a distinction Per finds deeply unfair and has raised as a grievance more than once, though Elin has held firm on this particular point for reasons she has never fully explained, perhaps some private instinct that naming an animal destined, eventually, for the cooking pot makes an already difficult household task considerably harder than it needs to be. There are 4 of them currently, though the number shifts slightly year to year, housed in that same low shed built into the hillside that shares the family's own earth-insulated warmth, and they earn their keep steadily enough through the warmer months, laying with a reliability that thins considerably, as I mentioned earlier, once the days shorten toward winter. Beyond the specific clearing where Nils tends his charcoal mounds, the forest itself provides for this family in a dozen quiet ways across the year that go beyond the berries and mushrooms already mentioned. Nils sets simple snares along a route he checks every few days through the colder months, catching hare occasionally, a welcome addition to a winter diet grown monotonous on stored root vegetables and salted pork, and Britta has recently begun learning to check these snares herself, under close supervision, a skill Nils is teaching her with the same patient, wordless method his own father used to teach him the charcoal trade, more demonstration than explanation, trusting her hands and her attention to absorb what her ears alone could not properly hold on to. Wild honey, gathered carefully from a hollow tree Nils located some years back, and has kept a close protective watch over ever since, sweetens the household's diet in a manner more precious than sugar bought at market, rationed out across the year in small enough amounts that a single jar, gathered in late summer, generally lasts well into the following spring if the family is careful, which they always are, because a lapse in carefulness here means an entire year without it. Let me tell you finally, properly, how Elin and Nils actually met, because I skipped past it earlier and I think it deserves its own quiet space rather than being folded into a passing mention. They grew up in neighbouring parishes, close enough that their paths crossed occasionally at larger markets and at the kind of parish gatherings that drew people from several districts at once, but they did not properly know each other until Elin was 19 and attended, along with several other young women from her own parish, a haymaking gathering on a farm that happened to sit roughly between their two home villages, one of those large cooperative efforts where several neighbouring households combined their labour for a few intense days to bring in a harvest none of them could manage entirely alone. Nils was there working alongside his father, and Ellen, by her own later telling, noticed him first not for anything dramatic but for the particular careful, unhurried way he handled a scythe. None of the show-off flourish some of the younger men favoured, just quiet, competent work that told her something true about him before he had said a single word in her direction. Their actual courtship, once it began, was brief and practical by the standards of any romance novel. A handful of conversations across that same haymaking week, a formal visit from Nils's father to Ellen's family some months later to discuss the possibility properly, and a wedding the following spring that neither of them describes, even now, as a particularly dramatic love story in the way you might expect from a tale told for its own sake. And yet, there is a particular detail Ellen has mentioned more than once over the years, unprompted, about that first haymaking week. A moment near the end of the final day when the whole exhausted group sat together in the shade of a hay wagon sharing water and bread, and Nils, without any particular ceremony, simply handed her the larger of two remaining pieces of bread rather than keeping it for himself. A small, unremarkable gesture that she says, still, all these years later, told her more about the kind of husband he might make than any conversation the two of them had that entire week. I find myself drawn to details like that one, honestly, the small, quiet, unglamorous gestures that end up meaning considerably more than any grand romantic moment ever could, and I think there is something worth carrying with you in that thought as your own evening winds down. The people who matter most tend to show it in exactly this way, in the piece of bread handed over without ceremony, rather than in anything louder than that. Britta at 10 has begun to think, in the private, half-formed way 10-year-olds think about their own futures, about what her own life might look like once she is grown, and it is worth spending a little time inside that particular hope because I think it says something gentle about how a childhood spent in a home like this one shapes a person's expectations. She does not dream of leaving, not the way you might expect, not of some grand different life in a city she has never seen and can barely imagine. Her hopes are smaller and, in their own way, more specific. She has told her mother more than once, a home with a proper loom of her own rather than sharing her mother's, and she has already, quietly, without telling anyone, begun setting aside small scraps of dyed wool from her mother's projects, imagining a particular pattern she might weave herself one day, something she has sketched in her own head so many times it has become almost as real to her as anything she has actually made. She wants children, she says, though she says this the way 10-year-olds generally say such things, more repeating an expectation absorbed from every woman around her than expressing any fully formed desire of her own yet. And she wants, this part said more quietly, more privately, a marriage like the one she watches her own parents share. Unshowy, steady, built on the kind of small daily kindness she has grown up surrounded by without ever having to name it as anything unusual. Ellen listens to these small declared hopes with a particular tenderness that she tries, not always successfully, to keep from showing too openly, aware that a mother's visible emotion about a child's future dreams can sometimes feel, to the child, like pressure rather than support. She wants, more than anything specific for Britta's actual circumstances, simply for her daughter to end up somewhere she feels the way Ellen herself feels most evenings, sitting by her own banked fire in her own small, warm room, which is to say at peace with the particular shape her life has taken, however modest that shape might look from the outside. Per, at 6, has no such formed thoughts about his own future yet, beyond a fierce, currently held conviction that he will one day be even better at charcoal burning than his father, a claim Nils receives with the appropriate gravity every time it is announced, nodding seriously and agreeing that yes, this is entirely possible, provided Per first learns to sit still through an entire church service, a condition Per accepts as reasonable without noticing that it has, so far, proven considerably harder to meet than mastering an entire trade. Let me take you into a single summer day now, fully, the way I took you into this winter evening earlier, because the contrast between the two is worth feeling properly rather than simply being told about. In summer, the family wakes with the light rather than well before it, though the light itself arrives so early and lingers so late this far north that the actual hours of sleep available shrink considerably compared to winter, a trade Ellen makes without complaint, understanding it as simply the season's own particular arithmetic. The morning air stepping out through that same low doorway carries none of winter's sharp bite, instead a soft, green, slightly damp coolness that will burn off within the hour once the sun properly clears the tree line, and there is a particular quality of birdsong filling this early hour that the household barely notices anymore, so constant and so woven into the season that its absence come autumn registers before its presence ever did. The work of a summer day scatters the family across a much wider physical territory than winter allows. Nils is often gone from before breakfast until well past dark during haymaking weeks, working not just his own family's borrowed meadow but helping across several neighbouring farms in the same reciprocal web of labour that defines so much of this district's rural economy. Ellen's own day fills with the frantic, joyful abundance of a season that offers all at once everything winter denies: berries to gather before birds and other foragers claim them first, herbs to harvest and dry at exactly the right moment in their growth, the garden plot beside the house demanding near constant attention through these few precious months of real growing weather. Britta and Per spend far more of a summer day outdoors, and considerably less of it under direct adult supervision than winter ever permits, and there is a particular freedom in this that both children clearly relish, disappearing for whole stretches of afternoon into the forest edge or down toward the small lake, returning sunburned and scratched and entirely delighted with themselves, secretive about whatever adventures filled the hours, though Britta, older now, has begun keeping a slightly closer, more protective eye on her brother during these unsupervised stretches than she used to, a small shift toward responsibility that Ellen has noticed with quiet pride without commenting on it directly. The long summer evening, when it finally arrives, feels utterly different from its winter counterpart. The fire burns lower, needed for cooking rather than for warmth, and the family often eats outside altogether, seated on a worn wooden bench Nils built years ago against the sun-warmed timber wall, watching the pale, endless twilight settle slowly over the hillside while Lingon the goat grazes contentedly nearby, and the whole world holds itself, for these few precious weeks of the year, in a kind of suspended, golden patience that everyone in this household, without ever quite saying so aloud, treasures more than almost anything else the calendar offers them. Let me tell you about the clothing this family wears, because it says something quiet and specific about how they balance practicality against the small pleasures of appearance, even living the way they do. Everyday clothing is almost entirely homespun. The coarse woolen cloth Ellen weaves through the winter months, dyed in those muted birch and alder tones I mentioned earlier, sturdy and warm and mended so many times over its useful life that a single garment might pass through several stages of purpose before it is finally too worn for anything but rags, a good shirt of Nils's becoming eventually a work shirt, and later still cut down and repurposed into something for Per, patched and patched again until barely any of the original fabric remains untouched by a needle. Nothing gets discarded while it still holds together in any usable form. This is not desperation exactly, though I understand it might read that way at first. It is simply a different, older relationship with material goods than the one you and I mostly carry today, one where value is measured by remaining usefulness rather than by newness or fashion, and where a skilled mend is a point of quiet pride rather than a mark of poverty to hide. And yet there are, tucked away in that same iron-banded chest that holds the family's few valuables, garments reserved specifically for church and for occasions like midsummer, better cloth, sometimes even a small amount of purchased fabric rather than homespun, a particular deep blue that Elin traded 3 months of careful negotiation to acquire for a shawl she wears perhaps 6 times a year and treasures disproportionately to those few wearings. Britta has a ribbon, the one from market I mentioned earlier, that she wears in her hair for exactly these same special occasions, and there is a whole small, careful hierarchy of clothing in this household, everyday and better and best, that mirrors in its own modest way similar hierarchies you would find in wardrobes belonging to families with considerably more money than this one has ever had. Winter clothing layers heavily, wool against skin, wool again over that, and outdoors, when the cold demands it, sheepskin-lined coats that Nils's father made decades ago and that have been resized and adjusted across 2 subsequent generations of children growing into and then out of them. Mittens and socks, endlessly knitted and endlessly needed, given how quickly wet wool wears through against snow and ice, occupy a huge portion of Ellen's and increasingly Britta's spare hours through the coldest months. An unglamorous, constant labour that keeps this whole family's extremities functioning through temperatures that would otherwise make any outdoor work entirely impossible. There is a sight this family sees more often than most people alive today will ever see even once, and I want to give you a proper moment with it before we move any further into the night, because it belongs here in this particular quiet stretch of the story. On clear winter nights, especially the coldest and stillest ones, the sky above their hillside sometimes fills with the northern lights, pale green mostly, occasionally shifting towards something closer to rose or violet, moving slowly across the darkness in long rippling curtains that purr. The first time he was old enough to properly understand what he was looking at, watched in total, wordless silence for nearly 20 minutes, an astonishing feat of stillness for a boy who cannot generally sit through half that time for anything else at all. More Stina has her own name for this light, an old word passed down through her own grandmother, and her own explanation for it too. Something about the spirits of those who died in battle, still moving, still restless, across the winter sky, an explanation Ellen does not correct in front of the children, even though her own understanding, absorbed second-hand from a travelling scholar who once passed through the parish and spoke at length to anyone willing to listen, leans towards something about the sun itself, and forces she cannot fully describe, but finds no less wondrous for being explained differently. Whatever the true cause, and I will admit science has settled that question rather more definitively than either Illin or her scholarly visitor could have managed, the family still gathers outside, wrapped hastily in whatever blankets are nearest the door, whenever the display is strong enough to be worth the cold, standing together on the small packed earth clearing in front of their home, necks craned back, breath visible in pale clouds, watching a light show that costs nothing and asks nothing and simply arrives, unannounced, exactly when it chooses to. I think there is something worth sitting with in how a family with so little in the way of purchased entertainment or spectacle had access, several nights most winters, to something this remarkably extraordinary, free for the watching, requiring nothing more than stepping outside their own door at the right hour. It is homes like theirs, oddly enough, tucked into hillsides away from any concentration of other buildings or lights, that offer some of the clearest possible view of a sky like this, a small, unintended benefit of living somewhere the wider world had mostly overlooked. Sweden was hardly alone in building homes this way, and I think it helps to widen the frame just slightly before we come back to this one particular family, because the practice belongs to a much larger, older tradition stretching across the whole northern edge of Europe. In Iceland, turf houses served an even more central role in ordinary domestic life for centuries longer than Backstuga did in Sweden. Entire farms built almost completely from stacked turf over a timber frame, a necessity in a landscape with almost no trees to speak of, and stone that resisted easy shaping. Norway held its own long tradition of turf-roofed buildings, not always earth-sheltered on 3 sides the way Eland's home is, but sharing that same instinct toward using the land itself as insulation rather than fighting against it. Even parts of Scotland and Ireland developed their own related traditions of earth-banked or turf-walled cottages, arrived at independently, it seems, by people facing broadly similar problems of cold, wind and scarce building material, discovering broadly similar solutions an ocean apart from each other, without ever comparing notes. What strikes me most thinking about this wider pattern is how consistently it gets misremembered today wherever it shows up, as a marker of poverty and little else, when the actual historical reality, once you look closely at any one example properly, tends to reveal something closer to what we have spent this whole evening inside of, a genuinely intelligent, hard-won response to a difficult climate, refined across generations until it worked extremely well. Ellen's family did not live in a hillside because they could imagine nothing better. They lived in a hillside because someone, generations back, looked carefully at the specific problem a cold northern winter presents and arrived at a specific, elegant solution, and every family since has simply inherited and slightly improved upon that same good thinking. Let me tell you a little more about Stina's own youth now, because I have let her sit mostly in the present tense of this story so far. An old woman spinning wool and telling folk tales, and I think she deserves to be more than that before the night is through. She was, as a young woman, known through her own home parish for a truly lovely singing voice, good enough that she was regularly asked to lead the hymns at church long before she had any particular standing in the community to justify such a request otherwise, and there is a specific memory she still returns to sometimes unprompted of singing at a wedding 2 parishes over when she was perhaps 17. A wedding she attended only because a cousin had asked her along, and being approached afterward by an elderly woman she had never met before, who took both her hands and told her with total conviction that her voice was a gift she had a responsibility to keep using for as long as her breath allowed her to. Stina married Nils's father at 19, a match her own parents arranged with rather less input from Stina herself than she would have preferred, though she has said, more than once across the years, that she came to love him properly within the first year regardless, in that same slow, accumulated way Ellen describes her own marriage growing, a fondness built through shared work and shared hardship, rather than through any single dramatic moment. She lost him 12 years ago now, a fall from the roof while repairing storm damage, sudden and entirely unexpected, on an ordinary autumn afternoon, and she does not speak of that loss often, though Ellen has noticed, over the years, that Stina's hand sometimes drifts, without her seeming to notice it herself, to a small carved wooden button she keeps threaded on a cord around her neck, the last button from a coat she made him decades before he died, kept close against her skin ever since. Her singing voice has thinned with age, though it has not disappeared entirely, and on the rare evenings when the whole family sings together, usually around Christmas, hers is still, unmistakably, the voice that carries the melody true when everyone else's wavers, a small, quiet inheritance from that 17-year-old girl at a stranger's wedding, carried forward across an entire lifetime into this low, warm room on this particular winter night. Beyond the walls of this house, the forest at night carries its own particular population of sounds, and I want you to spend a moment with them now, because they are as much a part of what it feels like to live here as anything happening inside the 4 walls we have spent most of tonight inside of. An owl calls somewhere down the slope most clear nights, a long-eared owl that has nested in the same stand of old pines for as long as anyone in the family can remember, its call low and hollow and, to ears that have grown entirely used to it, more comforting than eerie, a familiar voice marking the hours the way a distant church bell might mark them in a more populated place. Foxes move through the district too, their calls sharper, stranger, occasionally startling enough that Purr, on the rare nights he is still awake to hear one up close, burrows a little deeper under his blankets before curiosity generally wins out over caution and he asks in a whisper what that was, receiving the same patient answer every time. Wolves were more of a presence in this region a generation or 2 back than they are now, though Stina still remembers a winter in her own childhood when a small pack came close enough to the district that livestock had to be brought in and watched overnight for several weeks running, a memory that surfaces in her stories occasionally, told with the specific weight of something that was actually frightening at the time and has softened, decades later, into something closer to an adventure worth retelling. Elk move through the deeper forest too, mostly unseen, their presence known more through the marks left on young trees than through any direct sighting, and Niels has learned across years of solitary nights beside his charcoal mounds to read the whole quiet population of the forest around him through sound and sign alone, a kind of fluency that took decades to build and that he has never once thought to describe as impressive, simply as ordinary, simply as knowing your own neighborhood, which in the broadest sense is exactly what it is. The wind through the pines above their hillside makes its own particular sound too, different from wind through any other kind of tree, a long, steady, breathing hush rather than a rattle. And it is this sound, more than any other single thing, that Ilin associates most completely with the idea of home, having grown up in a parish further from the forest's edge where the wind moved differently through open fields, and having noticed in her first winter in this house as a new bride how quickly this new sound replaced the old one as the sound her body simply expected to hear before sleep could properly arrive. I want to say a little more about where Nils's charcoal actually goes once it leaves this hillside, because I think it connects this small, quiet household to a much larger story that most people never think to draw the line toward. The ironworks that buys his charcoal sits the better part of a day's travel away, a substantial operation by the standards of this district, employing dozens of workers and producing iron that travels further still into tools and fittings and in growing quantities through this particular stretch of the century. Rails and machinery parts feeding directly into the industrial changes reshaping Sweden and much of Europe alongside it. Every load Nils delivers, hauled by a borrowed horse and cart over a route he has travelled so many times he could probably manage it with his eyes closed, becomes a small, anonymous piece of the much larger transformation, fuel for furnaces that will never know his name, iron that will end up in places he will never see, doing work he could not begin to picture from the quiet vantage point of his own forest clearing. There is something worth sitting with in that connection, I think. A family living about as close to the old traditional rhythms of rural Swedish life as it was possible to live in this particular decade, and yet feeding through the most literal possible supply chain directly into the newest, most modern industry the country had. Nils has never once visited the ironworks itself, has no particular curiosity about the machines his charcoal eventually helps power, and would likely find the whole operation bewildering and rather too loud for his taste if he ever did see it firsthand. And yet his labour is woven into it all the same, an old world quietly, invisibly sustaining a new one, a pattern that repeated itself in 1,000 forest clearings just like his across the whole breadth of the Swedish countryside through this particular era, mostly unnoticed then and almost entirely forgotten now. The ironworks pays fairly by the standards Nils has known his whole working life, and the coin he brings home from each delivery gets divided with the same careful practiced arithmetic Elin applies to everything else, a portion set aside for the year's rent obligations, a portion for whatever the household cannot produce itself, salt, certain tools, the occasional length of purchased fabric, and whatever remains, however small, tucked away in that same iron-banded chest as a slim, hard-won cushion against whatever the next hard winter might demand of them. There is a dog that belongs to this household too, an old grey muzzled creature named Bjorn, technically Nils's dog originally, acquired as a half-grown stray that wandered in from the forest one autumn many years back and simply never left, though he has become over the intervening years most devotedly Per's companion, following the boy through nearly every waking hour with a patient, unhurried loyalty that seems entirely unbothered by how often Per forgets to properly feed him on time. Bjorn sleeps most nights curled against the hearth, close enough to the banked fire to catch its lingering warmth, and he has developed, across his many years in this household, an almost uncanny sense for exactly when Nils is due home from an extended charcoal burn, rising and moving to the door and waiting there, ears pricked, sometimes a full hour before Nils actually appears down the forest track. A small daily miracle nobody in the family has ever managed to properly explain. He is getting old now, grey around the muzzle in a way that worries Per more than he lets on, slower to rise from the hearth than he used to be, and there was a conversation, quiet and brief, between Elin and Nils a few months back, neither of them saying the actual words out loud, but both understanding perfectly what the other meant, about how many more winters a dog like Bjorn realistically has left in him. Nobody has said anything to the children yet. There will be time enough for that conversation when it actually needs having, and for now Bjorn still rises for his evening greeting at the door, still curls faithfully against the warm hearthstones each night, still very much a fixture of this household exactly as he has been for as long as either child can properly remember. Religious education fills a fair portion of both Children's Week, as it does for nearly every child in the parish. Pastor Lindquist holding a regular catechism class that Britta attends dutifully, and Per attends with rather less patience, both of them expected to be able to recite key portions of Luther's small catechism from memory by a certain age, a requirement taken seriously enough across the whole district that a child's confirmation, still some years off for both of them, functions as a genuine milestone, marking the formal transition from childhood into the beginnings of adult standing within the community. Elin herself was taught to read specifically for this purpose, catechism and scripture, rather than any broader literacy, and she has passed that same limited but genuine literacy down to Britta, the two of them working through the family's small handful of religious texts together on quiet winter afternoons. Britta's reading growing steadily more confident with each passing season. There is a small churchyard beside Pastor Lindquist's church, where 3 generations of Nils's family now rest, his father among them, and Elin's own daughter Ingrid too, in a small plot marked with a modest wooden marker that Nils carved himself in the weeks after her death, a task Elin has said, in the rare moments she speaks of that period at all, that she believes helped him grieve in a way words alone could not have managed for him. The family visits on specific occasions through the year, not with the heavy solemnity you might expect, but with something closer to quiet continuity, a brief stop after church some Sundays, a small posy of whatever wildflowers happen to be in season left at Ingrid's marker each summer, a tradition that started without anyone deciding it formally and has simply continued year after year, becoming its own small, settled ritual. I think there is something worth noticing in how naturally death sits alongside daily life in a household like this one, not avoided, not made into something frightening or hidden from the children, but folded gently into the ordinary rhythm of the year. A churchyard visited the same unhurried way the market is visited. Ancestors remembered the same steady way a recipe or a drainage technique gets remembered. Simply another thread woven into the whole continuous fabric of this family's understanding of itself across time. Britta knows Ingrid's story, told to her gently by her mother a few years back when she was old enough to understand it properly, and she has never once treated the knowledge as a burden, instead absorbing it the way children often absorb the quieter truths of their family's history as simply one more true thing about who they are. Neither hidden nor dwelt upon, simply known. Ingeborg, a mile along the ridge, visits her own husband's grave rather more often than this family visits Ingrid's, a difference Elin has never once commented on, understanding without needing it explained that 6 years of solitary widowhood asks something different of a person's grief than the more distributed sorrow of a loss shared across an intact family. Ingeborg was married for over 20 years before her husband's fever took him, a marriage by all accounts as steady and quietly affectionate as Elin and Nils's own, and she has managed in the 6 years since to hold her own small Backstuga and her own small life together with a resilience that the whole district has come quietly to deeply admire, even as they continue offering the small regular kindnesses, the shared meals, the traded preserves, the excuse-laden visits that make a solitary life like hers bearable through a long Swedish winter rather than simply endurable. I promised you hours ago now that the word Backstuga would fill in slowly across tonight's story, and I want to make good on that properly, because there is a real story behind how a family ends up living inside a hillside at all, and it deserves more than a passing mention. A Backstuga, translated roughly and a little clumsily into English, means something like a cottage built against a hill, or into a hill, or beneath one, depending on the particular slope of land a family happened to end up with. It is not a cave, though people sometimes picture it that way when they first hear the description, and it is not the grim, half-buried hovel your imagination might be reaching for either. It is a real home, built with real skill, and it kept a family like Ellin's warmer through a Swedish winter than a great many grander houses managed to stay. Let me sit with why a family ends up living this way before we go any further, because it says something true about who these people were, and it is not the story of failure you might expect. Sweden in the 1800s had a great deal of land and, for a long stretch of that century, a growing number of people with no legal claim to any of it. Farms were passed down whole, generally to a single heir, which meant that younger sons, unmarried daughters, elderly widows, and simply anyone who was not first in line for inheritance had to find somewhere else to stand. Some became servants living inside another family's farmhouse. Some hired themselves out as day labourers, moving from one farm's needs to the next through the growing seasons. And some, families like Ellen's, were granted a small patch of otherwise useless land, usually the poorest corner of someone else's holding, a rocky slope too steep to plough, a hillside nobody else wanted, in exchange for labour owed back to the landowner at harvest time or whenever extra hands were needed. On that patch of unwanted hillside they built, and here is the part I find myself sitting with the longest. A hillside that nobody wanted for farming turned out to be, in a strange and rather wonderful bit of luck, exactly the kind of land you want if you're building a home meant to hold heat through a long winter. The earth itself, packed around three sides of a house dug part way into a slope, does something a freestanding wooden wall simply cannot do on its own. It holds a temperature, not summer warm and not winter cold, but something steadier, something the ground keeps to itself no matter what the sky above it is doing. Nils understood this the way his father understood it before him and his father before that, not as a theory written in a book, but as a fact proven every February for as many generations back as anyone could count. Building into a slope sounds simple when I say it like that, and it was anything but. The single detail that decided whether a Backstuga stayed dry and pleasant or turned damp and miserable within a year had almost nothing to do with the walls themselves, and everything to do with water, specifically where the water went once it hit the hill above the house. Nils dug a drainage channel along the uphill side of their home the autumn before Britta was born, a shallow trench angled just so, carrying rain and snowmelt around the structure rather than through it, and he still walks that trench every spring with a spade over his shoulder, clearing it of leaves and collapsed dirt before the thaw arrives in earnest. He does this without much ceremony. It is simply the first outdoor task of the year, the way checking a roof for storm damage might be the first task where you live. Skip it even once, and water finds its way into a wall built half from earth, with a patience that would be almost admirable if it were not so destructive. The walls that were not earth were timber, thick horizontal logs notched together at the corners the way you might have seen in pictures of log cabins, though a Backstuga's timber walls only ever face the open side of the house, the side not already held by the hill itself. Between the logs, moss was packed tight, a specific kind gathered from the bog half a mile from their door, moss that swells slightly when it takes on moisture rather than rotting the way ordinary packing material might, sealing each gap a little tighter with every damp season rather than a little looser. Ellen's grandmother had taught her which patches of bog moss to trust for this and which to leave alone, a small, specific piece of knowledge passed down the way a recipe gets passed down, except nobody would ever have thought to call it a recipe. That roof, currently supporting one contented goat, was built in careful layers, birch bark first, laid shingle fashion so each sheet overlapped the one below it and shed water downward rather than letting it seep between the seams, and turf packed on top of that, thick enough to insulate, thin enough not to collapse the beams beneath it under its own weight once it was thoroughly soaked through with rain. It is a remarkably clever system when you actually look closely at it, birch bark being nearly waterproof on its own, almost rubbery, and the turf above it doing two jobs at once, holding heat in below and holding the birch bark down against wind that would otherwise peel it back like the pages of a book. Once every 10 years or so, a Backstuga's turf roof needs more than the small seasonal patching Nils performs each spring, needs instead a full relaying, the old turf stripped away entirely, the birch bark beneath inspected and replaced wherever it has begun to crack or thin, fresh turf cut and laid in new overlapping rows before the whole roof is left to properly root itself into place across the following growing season. This is not a task one family manages alone, and it has become, over generations in this district, something closer to a small communal event, neighbours from 3 or 4 nearby households arriving to help across what is usually a single long, demanding day, repaid in turn when any one of their own roofs eventually needs the same treatment. The family's own roof was relaid 2 summers back, and Ellen still describes that day with a particular fondness. A dozen or so people working together through the daylight hours, considerable good-natured complaint about the weight and awkwardness of wet turf, a shared midday meal spread out on blankets in the small clearing in front of the house that turned the whole exhausting labour into something closer to a celebration than a chore. Olof himself came to help that day, an unusual gesture from a landholder toward a family holding land only through informal arrangement, and Ellen has wondered since, though never asked directly, whether it was simple neighbourliness or something closer to quiet acknowledgement of exactly how much this family's presence and skill has come to matter to the wider running of his own farm over the years. Lingen the goat, incidentally, was thoroughly unimpressed by the sudden disruption of her usual grazing territory that day, expressing her displeasure with a persistent, indignant bleating that provided most of the day's comic relief, until she discovered, partway through the afternoon, that the freshly cut turf being laid across the new roof was considerably more appealing than the old, well-grazed patch she had been complaining about losing, at which point her objections stopped entirely and she spent the rest of the day contentedly sampling the new roof before it was even fully installed, much to everyone's amusement and Nils's mild, resigned exasperation. Bread baking day happens roughly every 2 or 3 weeks through the colder months, and it is worth pausing on properly, because it reshapes the entire rhythm of the house for the better part of a full day, and produces, alongside the bread itself, a very particular kind of warmth that lingers in the walls for days afterward. Ellen rises earlier than usual on baking days, tending the small clay and stone oven built into the thickest part of the earthen wall, a separate structure from the main hearth, fed with a hot, fast-burning fire for the better part of 2 hours until the whole interior has heated through completely, at which point the coals and ash are swept out and the actual loaves go in, dozens of them at once, the whole batch meant to last the household 2 or 3 weeks. The rye dough itself was started the evening before, a portion of the previous batch kept back specifically to leaven the next one, a continuous, unbroken chain of the same living culture passed down through this exact oven for longer than anyone in the family can actually trace, the same patient, quiet continuity that runs through nearly everything else in this household's daily life. The whole house fills, on baking day, with a warm, faintly sour, deeply comforting smell that Britta says, every single time without fail, is her favourite smell in the entire world, a claim she has been making since she was old enough to form the sentence, and shows no sign of revising any time soon. Per's job on baking day, self-assigned rather than officially given, is testing the very first loaf the moment it is cool enough to touch, a task he performs with the utmost seriousness, breaking off a small corner and pronouncing judgment with exaggerated solemnity, as though the whole household's fate depended on his verdict, rather than simply everyone already knowing, every single time, that the bread is exactly as good as it always is. Butter comes from the small amount of milk the family manages to acquire through trade with a neighbouring farm, churned by hand in a tall wooden churn that Britta has recently graduated to operating on her own for short stretches, her arms not yet strong enough to manage a full churning session alone, but proud, visibly proud, every time she is trusted with even a portion of it. The particular rhythmic thump of the churn, steady and unhurried, is one more sound woven so completely into this household's ordinary week that nobody consciously notices it happening anymore, background music to whatever else is occupying the room at the same time. A travelling peddler passes through this stretch of the district perhaps 3 or 4 times a year, a wiry, weathered man named Jonas who carries a pack considerably larger than his own frame would suggest he could manage, filled with small manufactured goods no household this far from a proper town could easily obtain otherwise. Needles and pins, buttons, small mirrors, occasionally a bolt of printed cotton fabric that draws every woman in the district out to examine it, whether she can actually afford a length of it or not. His visits are announced well before he actually arrives, word passing hillside to hillside faster than his own walking pace, so that by the time he reaches any particular household, they have generally had a day or two to consider what, if anything, they might trade or purchase from him. Ellen rarely buys much, careful as she is with the household's slim reserve of actual coin, but she always spends a genuine quarter-hour examining whatever Jonas has laid out on the small cloth he spreads across their doorstep, and there is a particular pleasure in that looking alone that has nothing much to do with actual purchasing. A brief window onto a wider world of manufactured goods and, more valuably still, a wider world of news, because Jonas carries gossip and information from every household along his route with the same thoroughness he carries his actual wares, and a half-hour with him generally tells this family more about the wider goings-on of the district than a month of their own more limited daily circuit could have managed alone. He stayed for supper the last time he passed through, as he sometimes does when the timing works out and a household has room enough to offer, and Per, thoroughly delighted by any visitor at all, peppered him with questions about every single item in his pack until Ellen finally, gently, redirected the boy's attention elsewhere, though Jonas himself seemed entirely unbothered by the interrogation, answering each question with the patient good humour of a man who has clearly fielded exactly this same enthusiasm from exactly this same kind of 6-year-old in 100 other households along his route. The nearest proper town lies a full day's travel beyond even the village where the parish church stands, a place the family visits perhaps twice a year at most, for the larger seasonal markets that draw traders and goods well beyond what the small local gatherings ever offer, and I think it is worth spending a moment on how remarkably different that world feels compared to the quiet hillside these 5 people call home the rest of the year. It holds proper shops, glass-fronted in a way that still strikes Britta as faintly magical every single time she sees it, and streets considerably busier and noisier than anything her own daily life prepares her for, church bells ringing at hours that seem to her oddly disconnected from any actual task they might be marking, and a general density of strangers, so many unfamiliar faces in such a small space, that Per tends to grow quiet and clingy within the first hour of any town visit, overwhelmed in a way he never is anywhere else, holding tightly to Ellen's skirts rather than his usual habit of darting off in 6 directions at once. Nils handles the family's business there with the same unhurried, careful competence he brings to everything else, a delivery of finished carved goods to a shopkeeper who has bought from him steadily for several years now, a small purchase of items simply unavailable any closer to home, a length of good needle steel for Ellen, salt in a larger quantity than the local trade generally allows, and, once memorably, a proper storybook for Britta, purchased on something close to a whim when Nils noticed her lingering, wistful and silent, in front of a bookseller's window for considerably longer than the family's schedule that day really allowed for. Ellen finds the town exhausting in a way she has never quite managed to explain properly, not unpleasant exactly, simply a great deal all at once, sound and movement, and unfamiliar faces pressing in from every direction, and she is always, without exception, quietly relieved once the family turns back toward home, the noise of the town fading gradually behind them, the familiar quiet of the forest track rising up to replace it mile by mile, until somewhere along that final stretch, cresting the last low ridge before their own hillside comes into view, something in her whole body seems to loosen and settle, recognizing, the way a body recognizes such things without needing to be told, that she has arrived back exactly where she belongs. There was a wedding last spring, in the neighbouring parish where Ellen herself grew up, that the whole family attended. A cousin of Ellen's marrying a young farmer from a modestly prosperous household, and I want to spend a little time on it, because a proper village wedding in this era carries a particular festive weight that stands apart from almost anything else in the ordinary rural calendar. The ceremony itself, held in the small stone church Ellen attended every Sunday of her own childhood, was brief and formal in the way church ceremonies of this era generally were, but the celebration that followed stretched across the better part of 2 full days, the whole gathered community moving from the church to the bride's family farm for a feast that drew on months of careful preparation and saving. Tables set up outdoors under a canopy of early spring leaves, more food laid out at once than this family typically sees across several ordinary weeks combined. Britta, 12 at the time of this particular memory, though the wedding sits fresh enough in her mind that she still describes it in vivid, exact detail whenever it comes up, was utterly captivated by the bride's dress, not elaborate by any standard beyond this district's own modest expectations, but finer than anything Britta had personally ever seen up close, and she has mentioned, more than once since, a private half-formed hope that her own wedding, whenever it eventually happens, might include something even half so lovely, a hope Ellen has neither encouraged nor discouraged, simply listened to with the same careful, tender attention she gives most of her daughter's small declared dreams. Nils and Ellen danced that second evening too, as they do every midsummer, and there was something Ellen noticed and mentioned to nobody at the time, watching her husband move through the same easy, familiar steps he has danced with her for 12 years now, a small ache of gratitude that arrived unbidden and entirely without warning, the particular sharp, sudden awareness of how truly fortunate her own ordinary life has turned out to be, a feeling she has learned, over the years, tends to arrive most powerfully at exactly these unguarded, celebratory moments, when the daily grind of survival briefly loosens its grip and simple joy is allowed, for a few hours, to occupy the whole of a person's attention instead. There is a small iron cooking pot hanging above the hearth right now, the same one this household has used for every soup and every porridge across the entire span of this evening's story, and it carries its own quiet history worth pausing on before we return, finally, to the business of settling this family down for the night. It belonged first to Nils's grandmother, purchased new in a year nobody in the family can precisely name anymore, at real and considerable expense for a household of their modest means, the kind of single significant purchase a family made perhaps once in a generation and then maintained, carefully, patched and repaired rather than replaced, for as long as it could conceivably be kept functional. It has a small dent along one side, acquired decades ago in circumstances the family's own oral history has slightly blurred and slightly embellished over repeated tellings, either dropped during an especially hurried packing before a threatened flood, or knocked from its hook by an overly enthusiastic dog considerably younger and considerably clumsier than the aging Bjorn currently dozing by the fire, depending on which family member happens to be telling the story on any given evening. Ellen uses it daily without much conscious thought for its history, the way you might use any thoroughly familiar tool, and yet she has also on quieter evenings run her fingers along that same small dent and felt something close to what I imagine you might feel handling any object that has actually outlasted several of the people who once relied on it. A strange, quiet intimacy with a whole chain of women who stood exactly where she is standing now, stirring exactly this same pot, worrying over exactly these same daily questions of whether there was enough to properly feed a family through to spring. She intends, though she has never said this plainly to Britta, for the pot to pass to her daughter eventually, whenever Britta has a household of her own to run, one more small, unremarkable object carrying forward a thread of continuity that none of the individual women holding it across the generations ever thought to treat as anything grand or significant, simply as the ordinary, accumulated weight of a family's shared, ongoing life, one dented iron pot at a time. Sunday holds its own particular shape in this household, distinct from every other day of the week, and I want to walk you through it briefly before we finally settle into tonight's own quiet ending, because it says something worth knowing about how faith and rest and community weave together across this family's whole ordinary rhythm. The walk to church takes the better part of an hour each way, longer in deep snow, and the whole family makes it together nearly every week regardless of weather, bundled heavily against the cold, Per generally carried part of the distance on Nils's shoulders once his own small legs inevitably tire, a journey that has become, across the years, its own quiet ritual of family time entirely separate from the destination it is aimed toward. The service itself runs long by modern standards, Pastor Lindquist given to thorough, unhurried sermons that Per endures with a fidgeting patience considerably improved over the past year, but still, by his mother's own admission, rather a work in progress, while Britta, older now, sits through the whole service with genuine settled attention, occasionally mouthing along to hymns she has known by heart since before she could properly read the words on the page. Afterward, the churchyard steps become, for a good half hour or more, the district's genuine social centre. News exchanged, small pieces of business arranged, marriages discussed, and it is here, more than almost anywhere else in the family's regular week, that Ellen catches up properly with women from households she otherwise sees only rarely. A whole informal network of information and support conducted almost entirely on these same worn stone steps, week after week, across every season of the year. Sunday afternoon, once the family has made its way home again, settles into genuine rest, the one day of the week when even Nils, whose charcoal mounds otherwise demand attention regardless of the calendar, generally allows himself to simply sit, mend a tool perhaps, or carve, or, more often than he would probably admit to anyone directly, simply doze by the fire for an hour while the rest of the household moves quietly around him, a small, protected pocket of true idleness carved deliberately out of an otherwise thoroughly demanding week. Let us come back now to the exact evening we began this whole story inside of, hours ago. The fire burned low, the same 3 beds we looked at earlier in this telling, finally doing the quiet work they were built for. Per is already deeply asleep, has been for a while now, that particular boneless, total surrender to sleep that only very young children seem to manage, his breathing slow and even, one small hand still loosely curled where it fell against the blanket. Whatever dream is currently moving through him, if any is, leaves no visible trace on his face beyond the faint, occasional twitch of an eyelid, and Ellen, glancing over at him one last time before she lets her own eyes close, feels the same small, private wave of tenderness she feels every single night at this exact moment, watching her son's face go entirely soft and unguarded in a way it almost never manages while he is awake and busy conquering whatever small adventure has captured his attention that day. Britta drifts more slowly, the way she generally does, her mind still turning over some fragment of the day. Tonight, perhaps, the particular pattern she has been imagining for her own future loom. Colours and stripes rearranging themselves behind her closed eyes in a loose, pleasant, half-formed sequence that will likely dissolve into proper dreaming within another few minutes, though she is not asleep quite yet, still faintly aware of the familiar sounds around her, her grandmother's breathing settling into its own slow rhythm nearby, the faint tick of the cooling fire, her brother's small, contented sighs beside her. Morstina falls asleep the way she has fallen asleep for decades now, without much ceremony, simply closing her eyes at the end of whatever last quiet thought was occupying her, and letting the accumulated tiredness of a long day's spinning and sitting and storytelling carry her under, her hand resting, as it does most nights, loosely against the small carved button she keeps threaded on its cord, a habit so old and so automatic that she would likely be surprised if anyone pointed it out to her, to learn she still does it every single night. Nils lies still beside Ellen, his breathing already deepening toward sleep, his body carrying the particular loose, thorough exhaustion of a full day's physical labour, the kind of tiredness that asks for nothing more complicated than exactly this, a warm bed, a quiet room, and permission to simply stop moving for a while. He murmurs something, barely audible, some half-formed fragment about the drainage channel needing another look come spring, and Ellen, still awake a few minutes longer than the rest of her household, smiles slightly in the dark at the particular, familiar shape of her husband's mind even at the very edge of sleep, always circling back, gently, to the small practical business of keeping this home standing and warm and dry for one more year. Ellen lies awake a few minutes longer than the rest of her family, as she often does, not from any restlessness but simply because this final stretch before sleep has become, Over the years, one more small pocket of private stillness she has learnt to value rather than rush through. The snow is still falling outside. She can tell by the particular hush pressing against the small shuttered window that deepened, muffled quality sound takes on once enough of it has settled across the whole hillside, and she finds herself thinking, as she often does at exactly this hour, of the wider shape of the district sleeping around her. A mile along the ridge, Ingeborg is very likely settled into her own single bed by now, her own smaller fire banked the same careful way, alone in a room built with the same patient understanding of earth and drainage and insulation that keeps this household warm, managing her own solitary version of exactly the peace Ellen is currently feeling surrounded by her family. Further along, past the edge of the forest, Olaf's farmhouse sits dark and quiet too, a much larger household settling into its own version of this same nightly ritual, more beds, more bodies, the same essential stillness arriving all the same. And as the blacksmith's forge stands cold and silent at this hour, its daytime roar entirely absent, waiting for morning to bring it roaring back to life, Pastor Lindquist, in the small house beside his church, is likely deep in his own sleep already, tomorrow's sermon whatever thoughts occupied him tonight, and Kajsa the midwife rests too, though hers is the one household in the district that might, even at this late hour, be roused by an urgent knock, a baby deciding, as babies do, to arrive on its own schedule regardless of what hour the rest of the world has chosen for sleep. The whole district, in other words, is settling into exactly this same quiet, at exactly this same hour. Dozens of small warm rooms scattered across a snow-covered landscape, each one holding its own small collection of sleeping bodies, its own small fire banked low, its own particular version of the peace Ellen is feeling right now. And there is something in that wider picture, a whole sleeping district considered all at once, that she finds truly steadying to think about on nights when sleep takes its time arriving, a reminder that she is never quite as alone in this quiet hillside dark as the small circle of her own low-ceilinged room might otherwise suggest. But earth, packed thick against 3 walls of this house, holds its own steady, patient warmth through all of this, indifferent to the particular thoughts drifting through Ellen's mind, indifferent to the snow continuing to gather on the roof above her, simply doing the same slow, invisible work it has done every single night since Nils's grandfather first dug this home into this exact hillside, the same work it will keep doing long after tonight, long after this particular family, long after the specific worry about the drainage channel currently murmuring itself quiet in Nils's sleeping mind. There is a kind of comfort in that too, in the sheer patient permanence of packed earth and stone, holding its temperature the same steady way regardless of whoever happens to be sleeping against it on any particular night. Autumn brings the slaughter, a task considerably more central to this household's whole yearly survival than its brief mention earlier in the evening properly conveyed, and I want to give it the fuller attention it deserves because it shapes the family's entire relationship to the coming winter more than almost anything else in their yearly calendar. The household does not keep enough livestock to manage a full slaughter entirely on its own, and so this too becomes, like the roof relaying, a shared communal undertaking, several neighbouring families combining their modest holdings and their labour across a single cold, intensive day each autumn, the work itself demanding and unglamorous but approached, by long tradition, with a particular practical seriousness rather than any squeamishness, every part of the animal put to careful use, nothing wasted that could conceivably be preserved or eaten. Nils's specific skill, honed across years of practice, lies in the smoking, a small dedicated shed behind their house given over entirely to this one purpose for a week or more each autumn, slow fires of specific woods, alder mostly, tended with the same patient attentiveness he brings to his charcoal mounds, producing the smoked and salted meat that will supplement the household's diet steadily across the coming months. Ellen's own contribution centres on the salting and storage, a precise, unforgiving process that leaves almost no room for error. Too little salt and the meat spoils before winter's end, too much and it becomes nearly inedible, and she has, over her years running this household, developed exactly the kind of fine-tuned instinct for the correct proportion that no written recipe could properly capture, judged instead by feel and smell and a kind of accumulated wordless expertise that she is only now, slowly beginning to pass down to Britta, standing beside her at the salting trough, guiding her daughter's hands toward the correct texture and consistency through direct correction rather than any instruction that could ever be fully put into words. This whole intensive stretch of autumn labor, uncomfortable and demanding as any of it can be, carries its own particular satisfaction once complete. The smoking shed finally emptied and its contents properly stored, the root cellar filled alongside it with potatoes and turnips and the last of the season's preserved berries, a full accounting of the coming winter's food supply laid out and counted and, this particular year at least, judged sufficient, a quiet, considerable relief that settles over the whole household once the final tally is complete, the specific anxious arithmetic of survival resolved for one more year in their favor. There is a specific late September afternoon I want to describe properly now, a particular mushroom gathering expedition that has become, in the retelling, something close to a small family legend because I think it captures Britta's own particular character better than almost anything else I could tell you about her. She had wandered further from the usual gathering paths than she was strictly meant to, chasing a promising cluster of chanterelles that kept appearing just slightly further into the trees than the last one, until she realized, all at once, that she could no longer immediately place herself relative to home, a moment of genuine sharp fear that she has described since with a candour Elin finds rather admirable. No attempt to pretend she was never actually worried. Rather than panic further though, 7 years old at the time this particular story took place, she did exactly what her father had taught her, without either of them realizing, at the time, that the lesson was being absorbed at all. She stopped moving entirely, sat down against the base of a large pine, and simply listened, the way Nils listens beside his charcoal mounds, waiting for some familiar sound to orient her, and within a few minutes she caught the distant, unmistakable clank of Lingon's goat bell drifting through the trees, and followed that single steady sound calmly back toward home. Britta arrived considerably later than expected, mushrooms still carefully cradled in her gathered apron despite the whole ordeal, and Elin, who had been perhaps 20 minutes from genuine alarm by the time her daughter finally appeared through the tree line, felt the full, dizzying wash of relief every parent knows, followed almost immediately by the specific, complicated pride of watching her 7-year-old recount calmly exactly how she had solved her own small crisis without any adult help at all. Nils told the story that evening, said very little at the time beyond confirming that yes, that was exactly the right thing to do. But Elin noticed, in the weeks that followed, a particular new carefulness in how he began teaching Britta to read the forest properly, a quiet acknowledgement that his daughter's instincts had already proven themselves reliable enough to build further skill on top of. She still carries a small, worn compass with her whenever she gathers in the deeper parts of the forest now, a gift from Nils shortly after that particular afternoon, purchased at real expense from Jonas the peddler on his very next visit through the district, and though she has never again strayed quite that far off the familiar paths, she keeps it in her apron pocket regardless, less for its actual navigational usefulness, she has admitted once or twice, than for the simple, steady comfort of having it there at all. The small lake I have mentioned once or twice tonight sits perhaps half a mile down the slope from their home, close enough for a summer evening's walk, and far enough that it feels, to the children especially, like its own separate small world entirely distinct from the ordinary territory of home and forest and charcoal mound. In summer it offers swimming, brief and bracing even in the warmest months this far north, Per shrieking with exactly the same delighted, theatrical horror he brings to the cold plunge after a bathhouse session, and fishing too, Nils occasionally managing an hour free enough to teach both children the patient, largely uneventful business of actually catching something, a skill Britta has taken to with rather more genuine enthusiasm than her brother, who tends to lose interest within the first 10 minutes, regardless of whether anything has actually bitten. Winter transforms the lake entirely, its surface freezing thick enough by midwinter to walk across safely, something Nils tests carefully each year before allowing anyone else near it, and it becomes, once confirmed solid, a favoured spot for the district's children to gather on the rare afternoons when chores allow it, sliding across the ice in makeshift games that have been passed down, essentially unchanged, across as many generations as the counting stick game the children play by the fire. Per has only recently been judged old enough to properly join these gatherings without an adult standing directly beside him, a small but genuine milestone that he treats with considerably more solemn pride than his actual behavior on the ice, wild and reckless and joyfully unconcerned with dignity, would ever suggest. There was a difficult afternoon 2 winters back, when Lingon the goat managed to slip on a patch of ice near the shed and injure a foreleg badly enough that the whole household spent several worried days uncertain whether she would recover properly. Nils fashioning a careful splint from thin, flexible wood and worn strips of cloth, checking it and adjusting it with the same patient, exacting attention he gives his charcoal mounds, and Per, distraught in the particular total, uncomplicated way only a 6-year-old can manage over an animal's suffering, insisted on sitting with her in the shed each evening until she was properly recovered. A vigil that lasted the better part of 2 weeks, and that Ellen still describes, fondly, as the first real evidence she saw of the kind of steady, caring person her son might grow into underneath all the noise and mischief that otherwise defines him. A grand manor sits some 3 hours' travel from this district, seat of a considerably wealthy family whose name appears occasionally in Jonas the Peddler's gossip and rarely anywhere else in this household's ordinary awareness, and I find myself thinking about it now, at this late hour, in a way worth sharing with you before we let this particular night finally close around us. That manor holds dozens of rooms this family will never see, fires tended by servants rather than by Ellen's own hands, walls built from cut stone rather than packed earth, and by nearly every material measure available to an outside observer counting such things, its inhabitants would be judged, without hesitation, considerably more fortunate than the 5 people and 1 aging dog currently settling into sleep in this single low room built into a hillside nobody else particularly wanted. And yet I do not think Ellen would trade her own life for that one. Not really, not once you get past the simple appeal of unlimited firewood and servants to manage it, because I am not certain that Grand House holds, in all its many empty rooms, quite the same particular density of warmth this one small room is currently holding. 5 bodies breathing quietly together, a family built slowly and deliberately across 12 years of shared labour and shared grief and shared small daily kindness. A whole accumulated life folded into a space you could likely walk across in 12 steps. I do not say this to romanticize hardship, and I want to be honest with you about that, because there is a difference between what I am describing and any kind of easy, uncomplicated comfort. This family works hard, every single day, in ways a wealthier household simply does not have to. Winters have been lean, a daughter was lost, a husband sleeps some nights beside a smoking mound in the forest rather than in his own warm bed. None of that disappears simply because the ending we have arrived at tonight happens to be a peaceful one, but there is, running underneath all of it, a particular kind of dignity and competence and quiet, accumulated love that this family has built for itself out of truly difficult circumstances, and I think that is worth honouring properly, on its own terms, rather than measuring it only against what it lacks compared to somewhere grander. Ellen, lying in the dark beside her husband, thinks none of these particular thoughts in quite these words, of course. She is simply at this late hour aware of a kind of settled, wordless gratitude that has become, over the years, her most reliable companion in exactly this last stretch before sleep, a gratitude for this particular warm room, this particular sleeping family, this particular ordinary, hard-won, thoroughly good life she did not always know, as a younger woman, that she would end up living. Let us stay here a while longer, in this quiet, settled room, because I do not think either of us needs to rush toward the end of this particular night. The fire has burned down further now, the last visible flame gone entirely, only the deep orange glow of banked coals remaining beneath their careful blanket of ash, casting almost no light at all across the room anymore, just the faintest warm suggestion of colour in the otherwise complete dark. Bjorn shifts slightly against the hearthstones, a low contented sigh escaping him without ever quite waking him, and somewhere beneath the layers of wool covering her, Ellen feels her own body finally beginning to properly let go, the particular loosening that arrives once a mind has run through its full quota of the day's small worries, and finds at last nothing more pressing left to hold on to. Outside, the snow continues its steady, windless fall, thickening across the roof where Lingen spent her afternoon grazing, settling deeper into the drainage channel Nils will need to clear again come spring, gathering along the narrow forest track that leads eventually to the ironworks, to the village, to the church, to the whole wider world this family moves through so carefully and so rarely, connecting this one small hillside to everything beyond it even now, even in full dark, even while every creature capable of choosing rest has already chosen it. If Morstina's old stories hold any truth at all, there is company keeping watch in the earth around this house even now, unseen, unbothered, acknowledging in whatever quiet way such company acknowledges anything, the small, consistent courtesy this family has shown them across 3 generations of careful digging and careful pouring and careful, murmured warning before anything gets disturbed after dark. Whether you believe in company like that or not, and I will admit I hold my own belief rather loosely, there is something comforting in the idea regardless, the notion that even the ground itself, in this particular telling, is not indifferent to the family sleeping above it, but rather a kind of quiet, watchful neighbour, content to let 5 tired bodies and 1 old dog rest undisturbed through a long winter night. The particular smell of this room at this hour, banked wood smoke and dried juniper, and the faint warm animal scent of wool blankets settling around sleeping bodies, is a smell Ellen has known her entire adult life, and one Britta and Per have known their entire lives outright, a smell that will likely follow both children forward into whatever homes they eventually build for themselves, the specific scent memory of safety and rest that a person carries forward, usually without ever quite noticing they are carrying it, from whatever room first taught them what safety actually felt like. I want to give you a longer, slower look now at the particular texture of a night like this one, because I think there is real comfort waiting for you inside these small, unhurried details if you let yourself settle into them properly. Think of the weight of a wool blanket, not light and not heavy either, simply steady, pressing down with exactly enough gentle resistance to remind a sleeping body that it is held, that it is covered, that nothing is expected of it until morning arrives to ask something different. Think of the particular quiet of packed earth walls holding a temperature that does not waver, that does not care whether the wind outside has picked up, or the snow has thickened, or the whole visible world has gone dark and still, walls that simply keep doing the same patient, unglamorous work they were built to do, hour after hour, regardless of anything happening beyond them. Picture breathing, 5 different rhythms in one small room, none of them matching exactly. Per's quick and shallow the way a child's breathing often runs, Bjorn's low and occasionally catching into something close to a soft snore, Morstina's slow and steady in the particular unhurried way an older body settles into rest, Britta's somewhere between her brother's and her grandmother's, still finding its own adult rhythm, and Nils's, deep and even, the specific sound of a body that worked hard all day and has now, finally, been given full permission to properly rest. Ellen listens to all 5 of these rhythms sometimes. On nights sleep takes its own slow time arriving, and there is a particular comfort in simply being surrounded by the sound of people she loves, breathing, alive, safe, held together in this one small warm room against the whole enormous cold and dark of a Swedish winter night. Notice the coals themselves, glowing faintly beneath their blanket of ash, doing exactly what Ellen asked of them when she banked them an hour or so ago, holding just enough warmth, just enough ember to be coaxed back to full life come morning without ever once fully going out. There is something in that small, ordinary domestic fact that feels, to me at least, worth carrying forward into your own night tonight, wherever you happen to be listening from. A fire does not need to burn bright to keep going, it only needs enough. A little warmth, carefully tended, patiently protected, is often entirely sufficient to carry a household or a person all the way through to morning. Let me take you a little further into the night now, past the point where any of this family remains even partly awake, into the deep, undisturbed middle hours that none of them will remember experiencing at all come morning, though I think there is something worth witnessing in them regardless, even second-hand, even imagined, even at this quiet distance. The snow outside has begun to slow by now, the heaviest of tonight's fall already settled across the roof and the yard and the long forest track, leaving behind the particular hush that follows any substantial snowfall, a silence deeper and more complete than ordinary nighttime quiet, sound itself muffled and softened by every surface now wearing its fresh, thick white covering. The moon, hidden earlier behind the thick clouds carrying tonight's snow, has begun to show itself in patches now as those clouds thin and scatter, casting brief, pale light across the clearing in front of the house, across Lingon's small shed, across the drainage channel Nils dug so many years ago and still tends every single spring without fail. Inside, nothing much changes across these deep, quiet hours. Bodies shift occasionally, the small unconscious adjustments any sleeping person makes across a long night. Per rolling further into the warmth of his sister's back, Britta murmuring something indistinct that means nothing at all and will be entirely forgotten by morning. Bjorn's paws twitching briefly through whatever dream currently occupies him, chasing something across some imagined stretch of forest his sleeping mind has conjured for the purpose. The fire holds its steady banked glow throughout, needing no attention at all through these hours, doing exactly what fires like this one have always done in houses like this one, keeping just enough warmth alive to make the coming morning's work of rekindling it that much easier. If you could stand outside this house right now, at this exact hour, in the cold and the settling moonlight and the thick undisturbed snow, and press your bare hand flat against the earthen wall, the way I suggested you imagine earlier tonight, you would find it exactly as steady and exactly as warm as it was hours ago, entirely unbothered by how far the temperature outside has continued to drop, entirely unbothered by anything at all beyond its own slow, patient work of holding heat against cold, holding warmth against the whole enormous indifferent dark of a Swedish winter night, the same simple, quietly brilliant work it has done every single night for 3 generations now, and will likely keep doing for a good many more nights after this one, long after this particular story has ended, long after you yourself, wherever you are listening from tonight, have finally, fully drifted off. I want to widen the picture just once more before we let this particular night finish settling around us, because Backstugor did not all look quite the way Ellen and Nils's home looks, and I think the variation itself is worth knowing. Further north, in regions where the ground froze deeper and stayed frozen longer, families building into hillsides tended to dig further back into the slope itself, sometimes leaving only a single timber wall and a low doorway exposed to open air at all, the rest of the structure wrapped almost entirely in earth on every remaining side, a design that traded a little natural light for a considerable gain in warmth, worthwhile in a climate colder still than the one this particular family manages. Further south, in gentler, less steeply hilled country, some families achieved a similar effect differently, building a more conventional timber structure and then mounding earth up against its outer walls deliberately, banking soil high against the sides the way you might bank snow against a door to block a draft, achieving much the same thermal benefit without the need for an actual hillside to dig into at all. The specific clay found in the soil of this particular district, dense and fine-grained, made it especially well suited to this kind of building, holding its shape properly once packed and compressed, rather than crumbling or washing away the way a sandier soil elsewhere might have, and Nils has always understood, in the same wordless, inherited way he understands everything else about maintaining this house, that his own family was fortunate in more than just the shape of the hillside they were granted. The ground itself cooperated, in its own slow mineral way, with everything 3 generations of careful building have asked of it. Even further north still, past the regions where Swedish farming families typically settled at all, the Sami people who have called that northern stretch of land home for far longer than anyone in Ellin's own family tree can trace, built their own distinct tradition of earth-covered dwellings, structures suited to a life organized around reindeer herding rather than settled farming, different in shape and purpose from a Backstuga but sharing that same essential, hard-won wisdom about how the earth itself, properly understood and properly used, can shelter a family through a cold no ordinary above-ground timber wall alone could ever quite manage on its own. It is, when you step back far enough to see it properly, a whole broad northern tradition of working with the land rather than simply building on top of it, stretching from this one modest hillside all the way up toward the Arctic itself, each version arrived at separately, each one in its own particular way, quietly ingenious. There is a small collection of tools kept just inside the door of this house, hung carefully on wooden pegs Nils set into the timber wall years ago, and I want to walk you through them briefly, because a household's tools tend to say something quiet and true about the actual shape of its daily life, more honest in their way than almost anything else in the room. An axe, well maintained and regularly sharpened, used for everything from splitting kindling to the heavier seasonal work of felling small trees for the charcoal mounds, its handle worn smooth in exactly the places Nils's grip falls most naturally after years of the same repeated motion. A spade, the one Nils carries every spring to clear the drainage channel, its blade nicked in a few places from years of striking buried stone, each nick a small, specific memory of a specific spring morning that Nils could probably still recall if pressed, though he has never once thought to try. A smaller hand axe, kept especially sharp, reserved for the finer carving work that produces the spoons and bowls and small wooden toys that supplement the household's income and, on occasion, delight a 6-year-old on his birthday. Ellen's own tools hang in a different corner, closer to the loom, a set of carved wooden shuttles worn to a particular smooth shine from years of passing through her hands, and a collection of drop spindles that Britta has recently begun practicing on herself. Awkward still, her wool coming off uneven and lumpy in a way that makes her mother smile rather than correct too sharply, remembering, I imagine, her own considerably clumsier first attempts at exactly this same skill some 20 years back. There is a whetstone too, shared by the whole family for whatever blade currently needs its edge restored, and a small collection of needles, kept carefully in a scrap of folded leather to prevent them scattering or rusting, each one a small, truly valuable object in a household where a single broken needle represents a real, if modest, cost to replace. Nothing here is decorative, nothing here exists purely for appearance, and yet there is a particular, quiet beauty in a collection of tools this well used, this carefully maintained, each one worn into exactly the shape that decades of purposeful use have given it, a kind of beauty that only accumulates slowly, only arrives through genuine, patient labour, and that no object bought new and unused could ever quite achieve on its own. Let me tell you about Ellen's very first winter in this house, 12 years back now, a new bride barely 19 years old, arriving into a household and a way of living considerably different from the one she had grown up inside, because I think it rounds out something important about how a person comes to feel that a place, however unfamiliar at first, is honestly their own. She has admitted since that her first weeks here felt strange in ways she had not fully anticipated, the low ceiling pressing closer than she was used to, the particular smell of packed earth and wood smoke unfamiliar enough that it took her the better part of a month before she stopped noticing it consciously every time she stepped through the door. More Stina, not yet the frail, spinning grandmother you have come to know tonight, but a considerably more vigorous woman still fully running her own household, was, by Ellen's own honest account, not always the easiest presence to share a kitchen with in those early months, two women accustomed to running things their own way, learning, slowly and with occasional friction, how to share the same small space without either one feeling entirely displaced. What changed it, Ellen says, was not any single dramatic moment, but a slow accumulation of small ones, learning which corner of the loom caught the best afternoon light, discovering her own particular knack for the salting work that Stina had never much enjoyed herself, finding, gradually, her own footing within a household rhythm that had existed for decades before she arrived, and would need. She came to understand her own genuine contribution rather than mere obedience to keep functioning well. By the time Britta was born, less than 2 years into her marriage, Ellen no longer thought of this house as somewhere she had arrived into. It had become, simply and completely, home, in exactly the way this whole evening has tried to show you it remains for her now. I think there is something worth carrying from that particular transformation, honestly. Something true beyond just this one family's specific circumstances. A place becomes home not through any single moment of arrival, but through this same slow accumulation Ellen experienced, small daily contributions and small daily comforts stacking gradually on top of each other, until, almost without noticing the exact turning point, a person looks around and realizes the unfamiliar has become simply theirs. There is one more small tradition worth telling you about before we let this family rest properly for the remainder of the night. A modest gift exchange the household holds each year on the shortest day of winter, well before the larger celebration of Christmas arrives, marking simply the turning point itself, the promise that however dark this particular stretch of the year has become, the light is now, slowly, beginning its long return. The gifts exchanged are small, always, never store-bought if it can be helped, each person crafting something through the preceding weeks in whatever private hours they can manage, kept carefully hidden from the rest of the household until the appointed evening arrives. Nils generally carves something, small and practical, a new spoon perhaps, or one year, memorably, a tiny wooden replica of Lingon the goat that delighted Per so thoroughly he carried it in his pocket for the better part of a full year afterward, its once crisp carved edges gradually worn soft and smooth from constant handling. Ellen knits or weaves something small, a new pair of mittens, a length of ribbon dyed in whatever colour she managed to coax successfully from that year's dye experiments. Britta has begun, these past 2 years, attempting her own small woven pieces for the occasion, proud and nervous in equal measure each time she presents one, watching her family's faces for genuine reaction rather than polite performance. Per's contributions remain more enthusiastic than skilled, a drawing scratched into a scrap of bark, a particularly smooth stone he found and decided, with total 6-year-old conviction, was exactly the right gift for his grandmother. Morstina's gift is never an object at all. It is every single year without fail, a story, chosen specifically for whichever family member she judges needs it most that particular winter, told with the same unhurried, total attention she brings to every story she tells. And this year, this exact evening we have spent tonight inside of, happens to fall very close to that shortest day, and though the formal exchange itself will not happen for another few days yet, Ellen finds herself already turning over, quietly, in these last drowsy minutes before sleep finally claims her too, what small thing she might make for each of the people sleeping around her right now, a private, warm anticipation that will carry her gently the rest of the way toward her own rest. And with that thought unfinished, unresolved, exactly the kind of small, warm, loose end a mind is allowed to carry into sleep, rather than needing to tie up first, Ellen's own breathing finally slows to match the rest of her sleeping household, and the whole small room, at last, settles completely into its long winter quiet. Let us stay a while longer in this quiet house, even now that every last person inside it has finally drifted off, because there is something worth sitting with in the stillness itself, and I do not think either of us needs to hurry away from it just yet. Picture the room exactly as it is right now. 5 sleeping bodies and 1 aging dog, arranged across 3 low beds and a scattering of hearthstones, breathing in 5 different unmatched rhythms that have, by now, settled into something close to a shared, unhurried pace. The fire holds its low, banked glow, needing nothing further from anyone until morning arrives to ask for it again. The single window, its old, wavy glass catching what little moonlight filters through the thinning clouds outside, throws the faintest pale suggestion of shape across the floor, barely visible, more felt than actually seen. Snow continues to gather, slow and silent, across the turf roof above, across the small shed where Lingen and the hens are settled into their own version of exactly this same undisturbed rest, across the long forest track leading eventually toward the church, the village, the wider world this family moves through so rarely and so carefully. I find myself thinking, at this late hour, about how many nights exactly like this one this particular hillside has held across the 3 generations this family has called it home, how many identical scenes of banked fire and settled breathing and gathering snow have played out in this exact small room, night after night, decade after decade, largely indistinguishable from each other, and yet each one, in its own way, entirely its own, belonging fully and completely to whoever happened to be sleeping here on that particular evening. Tonight belongs to Ellen and Nils and Britta and Per and Morstina and Bjorn. Some other night, decades from now, will belong to people not yet born, sleeping in beds not yet built, warmed by an earth that will, by then, have held this particular family's warmth and worry and love for the better part of a full century. There is something in that long, patient continuity, that I hope settles into you the same way it has settled into me across the hours we have spent together tonight, the same slow, steady comfort that packed earth wall offers this sleeping family, indifferent to the particular shape of any single night, endlessly, quietly capable of holding whoever needs holding, for as long as they need holding, one winter at a time. Morning will come for this family the way it always does, early and demanding in its own quiet way, Ellen waking first as she always does to coax the banked fire back to full life, Nils rising not long after to check the drainage channel and the roof and whatever the night's snowfall has asked of him, Britta gathering eggs, Per resisting waking for exactly as long as his grandmother's gentle threats will allow him to. The whole rhythm we have spent this entire night learning together will simply begin again, the same patient, accumulated life continuing forward one more ordinary day at a time, the way it has continued for 3 generations now and will likely continue for a good many more. But that morning is not yet here, and I do not think either of us needs to rush toward it. For now, this family sleeps, warm and safe and entirely unaware of the long, quiet hours still stretching ahead before daylight arrives to ask anything further of them. For now, the fire holds its steady, banked glow. For now, the snow keeps falling, slow and silent, across a roof built by hands that understood, better than most, exactly how to make an unwanted hillside into a properly good home. I want you to notice, if you can, the way your own body might be settling right now, here at the very end of this long, slow story, the particular heaviness that comes from staying still and warm and unhurried for this many hours together. If your own breathing has slowed to match the pace of this telling, good. If your own thoughts have gone soft and loose and difficult to properly hold on to, even better. That is exactly where I hoped this evening would eventually carry you, the same unhurried, settled peace that has, across this whole long night, gradually claimed every single member of the small household we have spent these hours getting to know. There is no need to do anything more right now. No need to finish a single thought. No need to resolve anything left hanging or unclear across the story we have told together tonight. Let it all simply rest, the way Ellen's own private hope about tomorrow's small gift rested, unfinished, entirely fine exactly as it is, carried gently into whatever comes next, rather than needing to be tied off first. I keep returning, in my own mind, to that image we opened with tonight, a goat standing calmly on a grass-covered roof while smoke rises gently past her from the chimney below, and I think it might be worth returning to one final time before we close, because there is something in it that captures, better than almost anything else I could tell you, the whole particular spirit of this family's way of living. It is an image that should feel, by any ordinary logic, faintly absurd. A domestic animal standing on top of a home rather than beside it, grass growing where you would expect only timber and thatch, and yet nothing about it is absurd at all, once you understand the careful reasoning behind it, the turf holding warmth, the goat's steady weight keeping that turf packed and sealed against the weather, 2 entirely separate needs solved by one single elegant arrangement that nobody particularly celebrated as clever at the time, because it was simply how things were done, generation after generation, on hillsides just like this one across the whole Swedish countryside. That is, in a way, the whole story we have spent tonight inside of. Ordinary people solving ordinary problems, with a quiet, unannounced ingenuity that deserves, I think, considerably more admiration than history has generally been willing to give it. The vitra, if they exist at all beyond the warm, comforting shape of an old woman's stories told beside a banked fire, are surely settled now too, wherever it is that unseen company settles for the night, satisfied, if satisfaction is a thing such company feels, with the careful, respectful courtesy this family has shown the ground beneath their home across 3 full generations of careful digging and careful pouring and careful, murmured warning before disturbing anything after dark. Nils will call out again tomorrow evening, quietly, almost without thinking about it, before he pours the dishwater out, exactly as he has done every single night of his adult life, and exactly as, I suspect, his own son might do one day, in some house not yet built, on some evening not yet arrived, carrying forward a small, private ritual whose exact origin nobody in the family properly remembers anymore, and whose actual meaning matters considerably less than the simple, steady fact of its continuation. Think, one more time, of the earthen wall itself, holding its steady, patient warmth through this whole long night, indifferent to the snow still gathering outside, indifferent to the particular hour, indifferent to anything at all beyond its own slow, ancient work. There is something I find myself wanting you to carry forward from that image specifically, something beyond the particular story of this particular family. You do not need a roaring fire to stay warm through a long, difficult season. You do not need grand gestures or dramatic solutions. Sometimes the most reliable warmth comes from something quieter and steadier than that, a well-built foundation, patiently maintained, doing its slow, unglamorous work without ever needing to announce itself or prove itself or be admired for it. Sometimes the best kind of shelter is the kind nobody else particularly wanted, the overlooked hillside, the unwanted corner, transformed through patient care into exactly the right home for exactly the life meant to be lived inside it. I think Ellen understood this, somewhere beneath all her ordinary daily busyness, long before she ever would have had the words to properly say it. I think Nils understood it too, in the wordless way he understands most things, checking his drainage channel each spring with the same quiet devotion a person might bring to any relationship worth truly maintaining. And I hope, if nothing else survives from this long night we have spent together, that some small version of that same understanding settles into you too, wherever you are listening from, whatever season of your own life you happen to be moving through right now. You do not need everything to be perfect, to be properly warm and properly safe and properly home. Sometimes patient, steady care, applied consistently across ordinary days, is entirely enough. Sometimes an overlooked hillside turns out to be exactly the right place to build. The forest around this small hillside is resting too, right now, in its own particular winter way, and I want to give you one last, slow look at it before we finally let this whole night settle completely into quiet. Pines above the house carry their heavy load of fresh snow without complaint, branches bowed low under the accumulated weight, occasionally releasing a soft, muffled fall as some small shift finally overcomes the snow's own grip, a sound so quiet and so infrequent that it barely registers as sound at all against the deeper surrounding hush. The bog half a mile off, where Ellen's grandmother once taught her which patches of moss to trust, lies frozen solid beneath its own blanket of snow, whatever slow, wet business it conducts through the warmer months entirely paused now, waiting, the same as everything else in this landscape, for spring to properly arrive and wake it back up. The lake where Britta learnt to fish, and where the district's children gather each winter to slide across newly solid ice, sits equally still, equally frozen, equally patient. Somewhere beneath the snow, small creatures have gone to ground the same deliberate way this family has gone to bed, denned and burrowed and waiting out the worst of the cold in whatever shelter each one has managed to find or build for itself, an entire hidden population of the forest observing, in its own instinctive way, exactly the same principle that shaped this family's whole approach to their home, that survival through a hard season depends less on fighting the cold directly and more on finding, or building, the right kind of shelter to simply wait it out inside of. Even the owl that calls most clear nights along this ridge has gone quiet for now, tucked somewhere within its familiar stand of old pines, resting the same as everything else, the whole visible and invisible population of this particular stretch of Swedish forest settled, for these few deep hours at least, into a shared, temporary stillness that asks nothing further of any creature holding it, human or otherwise, until whatever comes next decides it is finally time to stir again. Let me tell you about the storybook Nils bought Brita that day in town, because I mentioned it only briefly earlier, and I think it deserves a proper moment of its own before we finally close this night out completely. It is a modest thing, thin and plainly bound, a collection of old Nordic tales gathered and printed for exactly the kind of household that could afford only one such purchase in a good long while, and Britta has read it so many times now that certain pages have softened at the corners from handling, certain phrases worn smooth in her memory, the way a much-handled coin grows smooth from years of passing between hands. She reads from it aloud sometimes, on quiet evenings, her own voice taking over from more Stina's for a while, and there is a particular pride Ellen feels watching her daughter perform this small act of storytelling, a passing of the torch happening so gradually and so naturally that nobody in the household has ever formally acknowledged it as such. Per prefers more Stina's own oral stories to Britta's reading, if pressed to choose, finding something in his grandmother's telling, the pauses she leaves, the way her voice drops low at exactly the right moment, that the printed page cannot quite replicate for him yet, though Britta suspects, and has said so once or twice with the particular confidence of an older sibling delivering an unwelcome truth, that he will come around to loving the book properly himself once his own reading improves enough to manage it without her help. There is one particular tale in that thin volume, about a modest household that outwits a far grander one through patience and cleverness rather than strength or wealth, that Britta returns to more often than any of the others, and I find myself thinking, tonight especially, that it is not entirely a coincidence which story captured her attention most completely. A girl growing up in exactly this kind of modest, resourceful household, finding, in a printed tale about people not so different from her own family, a small, private confirmation that the particular shape of her own life carries its own genuine worth, regardless of how grand or humble it might look from the outside. Per has his own particular friendship worth mentioning too, a boy his own age named Gustav from a farm along the same forest track, the two of them having become, over the past year or so, nearly inseparable whenever their respective chores allow for it, an easy, uncomplicated companionship built on shared mischief and shared enthusiasm for exactly the same handful of games, the counting stick contest, elaborate imagined adventures through the forest edge, a running competition down the sloped path between their two homes that neither boy has ever definitively won, despite dozens of attempted rematches. Ellen and Gustav's mother have become friendlier themselves through their son's friendship, another small thread woven into the wider web of mutual support and quiet companionship that holds this whole scattered district together across every season of the year. I want to tell you about one more piece of Stina's accumulated knowledge before we let her rest properly for the remainder of tonight. Something beyond the herbs and the folk tales already mentioned, because I think it captures something particular about the way practical wisdom moves through a household like this one across generations. She knows, with an accuracy nobody has ever bothered to question, exactly how to read the coming weather from a dozen small, ordinary signs most people around her have stopped noticing consciously at all. The particular way wood smoke rises straight or bends on a still evening, the behavior of the hens in the hour before a storm properly arrives, the specific quality of ache in her own aging joints that reliably predicts a shift in pressure a full day before any visible change appears in the sky. Nils consults her before any extended charcoal burn, not out of mere filial politeness, but because her predictions have proven, across decades of quiet observation, considerably more reliable than his own younger instincts, and there is a particular, comfortable irony in a household this attuned to practical competence deferring, on this one specific matter, entirely to an elderly woman who can no longer manage the physical labour her own predictions are meant to guide. Stina is teaching Britta this too now, slowly, the same patient, largely wordless method by which most of this family's real knowledge gets transmitted, pointing out a particular cloud formation on a walk back from church, noting aloud the specific behaviour of Lingon the goat on an afternoon that later produces an unexpected storm, building, conversation by conversation, the same accumulated instinct in her granddaughter that took her own lifetime to properly develop. Britta absorbs it eagerly, more eagerly than she absorbs the weaving some days, drawn to the particular satisfaction of predicting correctly, of watching the sky confirm what her grandmother's small, careful observations had already told her hours before. I think there is something worth noticing, one final time tonight, in how much of what actually keeps a household like this one safe and warm and fed depends not on any single dramatic skill, but on exactly this kind of patient, accumulated, generational attention, small observations gathered and passed forward and gathered again, decade after decade, until an entire family's collective wisdom about their own particular hillside and their own particular forest and their own particular sky becomes something considerably larger and more reliable than any single person's knowledge could ever manage alone. Let me tell you finally about the particular quality of trust this family has built with each other across all these years, because I think it is the thread running underneath every single story I have told you tonight, whether I named it directly or not. Trust, in a household like this one, gets built almost entirely through repetition rather than through any single dramatic proof of loyalty. It is Nils splitting kindling slightly smaller than necessary, year after year, without ever once mentioning why. It is Elin keeping his second shirt mended before the first wears through, quietly, without being asked. It is Britta checking the snares under her father's patient supervision, earning, slowly, the trust to eventually check them alone. It is Per's absolute, uncomplicated faith that his grandmother's threat to eat his porridge will never actually be carried out, a small daily proof, repeated every single morning, that the people around him mean him only kindness, even when their words briefly pretend otherwise. It is more Stina's certainty, never once questioned across 12 years, that Elan will always ask her to keep score at the children's games, even on the evenings nobody else remembers to. This is not the kind of trust that announces itself. It rarely gets spoken aloud at all, in fact, and if you asked any single member of this household to describe it directly, I suspect they would struggle to find the words, the same way Nils struggles to explain why he still calls out before pouring the dishwater, or the same way Elin struggles to fully articulate why this particular house, however modest, feels more truly like home to her than the town she visits twice a year, with its shops and its glass windows and its considerably grander offerings. And yet it is there, underneath everything, holding this family together the same steady, patient way the earthen walls hold their warmth, unglamorous and largely invisible, and entirely, completely reliable. I think that might be the truest thing I can tell you about this family, at the very end of the long night we have spent together getting to know them. Not the goat on the roof, memorable as she is, not the folklore, or the charcoal trade, or the particular clever engineering of a well-built drainage channel. Just this, 5 people and 1 aging dog, built slowly into each other's lives across years of small, repeated kindness, warm and safe, and entirely, quietly, sure of each other on this one ordinary winter night, and on every other night that came before it, and, I hope, on every other night still waiting somewhere ahead of them. There is one final piece of this family's story I want to share with you before we let the night close properly around all of them. Something about how they think, quietly, about the future waiting beyond this particular winter, because I think it offers a fitting note to rest on. Nils has begun, this past year, teaching Per the very earliest, simplest pieces of the charcoal trade, nothing demanding yet, just small tasks, fetching specific tools, learning to recognize certain kinds of wood by sight and by weight, small building blocks that will, over the coming decade, accumulate the same way Nils's own understanding accumulated under his own father's patient, wordless instruction. There is no pressure in it, no formal expectation stated aloud, simply the same slow, natural transfer of knowledge and trade that has passed through this family for 3 generations now, offered without insistence and received, so far, with the same eager enthusiasm Per brings to nearly everything else in his young life. Elin thinks sometimes, in these late quiet hours especially, about what this house might look like in another 20 years, whether Per will eventually take it over the way Nils took it over from his own father, whether Britta will build some version of this same life elsewhere, with a household of her own, carrying forward the weaving and the careful salting and the particular, hard-won competence her mother has spent years passing down to her. She does not know, of course, cannot know, the way no parent in any century ever quite knows how their children's lives will actually unfold once fully out from under their own daily care. But she finds, thinking about it, not anxiety so much as a kind of settled, hopeful curiosity, a genuine interest in whatever version of this family's continuing story gets written by hands not yet grown into their full strength. More Stina, for her part, thinks less about the specific future and more, these days, about the specific past, the whole long chain of women who came before her in households not unlike this one, her own grandmother's stories about her grandmother's grandmother, a lineage stretching back further than anyone in the family can properly trace, each one holding down her own version of exactly this same warm, hard-won life. She feels herself, some nights, as simply one link in that considerably longer chain, neither the beginning nor quite yet the end, carrying forward what she received and passing along what she can before her own turn in this particular story finally, gently, concludes. This is, I think, the truest shape of what a family like this one actually is, not a single fixed picture frozen at any one moment, not even the particular warm sleeping tableau we have spent so many hours tonight sitting inside of, but something considerably longer and more continuous than that, a slow, patient chain of care stretching backward through generations already gone, and forward through generations not yet arrived, each individual link doing exactly what Ellen and Nils and Britta and Per and Morstina are doing right now, in this exact quiet hour, holding on gently to whatever warmth and safety and love they were given, and passing a little more of it forward than they received. Let me give you one more quiet stretch of description before we finally return to that closing image waiting for us, because I want this last portion of the night to feel as unhurried and as thoroughly settled as the family we have spent it with. Picture the hillside itself, one final time, from a little distance now, the way you might see it if you were standing at the edge of the forest track looking back toward the house. Snow covers everything evenly, roof and yard, and the low shed where Lingon and the hens are sleeping, smoothing every rough edge into the same soft, pale white, broken only by the faint, warm suggestion of the chimney's rising heat, a thin column of barely visible warmth escaping steadily upward into the cold night air, the one small sign, if you did not already know better, that anyone at all was living inside that particular gentle rise of snow-covered earth. There is nothing grand about this scene, and there was never meant to be. No towers, no grand gates, no sweeping drive leading up to an impressive front door, just a low, unassuming hillside, indistinguishable at a glance from a dozen other hillsides scattered across this same stretch of forest, holding within it, invisible from the outside, an entire small universe of warmth and history and quiet, accumulated love. I think that contrast, more than almost anything else I have shown you tonight, is the whole point of this family's story, the way the most ordinary-looking exterior can conceal, entirely without announcing it, something quietly remarkable happening within. The snow will keep falling for a while yet tonight, and then it will stop, the way all snowfall eventually stops, and the clouds will thin further, and somewhere past the deepest, darkest hour of this particular night, the first faint suggestion of grey will begin creeping back into the eastern sky, hours from now still, plenty of time yet before this family needs to stir, but that is a different story, a story for tomorrow, and tomorrow can wait. Tonight belongs entirely to this quiet, settled stillness, to snow falling gently over a sleeping hillside, to 5 sleeping bodies and 1 aging dog held safe and warm inside walls, built with exactly this kind of night in mind. Before we let this night close completely, I want to leave you with one final small detail, the kind of overlooked ordinary thing that has, I hope, become the whole texture of what tonight's story was actually about. Somewhere in the darkness of that iron-banded chest, wrapped in its scrap of worn linen, sits a small smooth stone gathered from a riverbank 12 years ago, carrying a private grief that has never once stopped this family from building an entire life of warmth and laughter and steady, accumulated joy around it. Somewhere on a cord against an old woman's skin, a carved wooden button holds a marriage that ended in loss but never once, even now, stopped shaping every quiet decision she makes. Somewhere in a boy's pocket, a small worn compass sits ready for whatever forest adventure tomorrow brings, a father's answer to a daughter's fright, carried forward now as a small steady comfort rather than a reminder of fear. Somewhere in a girl's private thoughts, a half-formed pattern for a loom not yet built waits patiently for the future it belongs to. None of these small things are grand. None of them would look, gathered together, like anything a historian might think worth recording. And yet they are, each one, a genuine piece of what makes this particular family, the accumulated small evidence of an entire life built with patience and care inside a hillside nobody else particularly wanted. I hope, carrying this story forward into whatever comes next for you tonight, that you take with you not the grand sweep of history I gave you earlier in the evening, useful as I hope that context was, but these smaller things instead: the stone, the button, the compass, the half-formed pattern waiting for its future, the particular, ordinary, entirely sufficient warmth of a family who built something truly good out of very little, and who are, right now, at this exact moment, sleeping peacefully and completely inside the warm, patient shelter of exactly what they built. Somewhere, too, in a household a mile along the same ridge, a solitary widow sleeps her own version of exactly this same peace, in a house holding its own version of exactly this same warmth, proof, if any more were needed tonight, that this particular kind of quiet, resourceful dignity was never limited to just one family, just one hillside, just one small warm room built carefully into the patient, generous earth of this corner of Sweden. It belonged, once, to a whole scattered population of households just like this one, tucked into hillsides across the entire countryside, each one holding its own small, sufficient warmth against a long, cold winter, each one in its own quiet way, entirely worth remembering properly, the way we have tried to remember this one properly across the whole of tonight. It is worth remembering one final time, and truly the very last time tonight, that none of this warmth arrived by accident, that none of it was ever simple luck at all. Every part of it, the drainage channel, the layered turf, the packed moss, the banked fire tended so carefully each night, was the product of patient thought and patient labor, refined across 3 generations until it worked about as well as a home like this one could possibly work. That is not luck, that is a family, and the families before them paying attention year after year, season after season, to what actually kept people warm and dry and properly fed through a hard, demanding season, and adjusting quietly, patiently, whatever needed adjusting, until the whole system simply, finally, reliably worked, the way it is working right now, tonight, around this one small, sleeping family, thoroughly beloved. And so, at last, we arrive back where I promised we would, at that same quiet, settled stillness holding this whole sleeping household, snow falling gently outside, fire banked low within, every last worry finally fully released for the night. There is a particular kind of peace available only at this exact hour, deep enough into the night that even worry has finally worn itself out, and I hope, wherever you happen to be right now, whatever corner of the world you told me about earlier this evening, whatever version of your own day is finally ready to release you, that some part of that peace has found its way to you too across the hours we have spent together tonight. Think of Ellen one last time, settled fully now into sleep beside her husband, whatever small private hope about tomorrow's gift still drifting, unresolved and entirely fine that way, somewhere at the very edge of her dreaming mind. Think of Nils, his own breathing slow and even, his whole body finally given full permission to rest after a day spent tending fire and earth and family, with the same quiet, unshowy devotion he brings to everything. Think of Britta, her thoughts about her own future loom finally dissolving into whatever proper dream has claimed her, and Per, boneless and entirely surrendered the way only a 6-year-old ever quite manages, and more Stina, her hand still resting against that small carved button, carrying forward, even in sleep, a devotion that has outlasted the man who first gave her reason for it. Think of Bjorn, twitching softly through some forest chase only he can see, warm against the same hearthstones that have warmed 3 generations of this family's dogs before him. And think, if it helps, of that same steady earthen wall, holding its patient warmth around all of them, around this whole small sleeping household, indifferent to the cold pressing in from outside, indifferent to the hour, indifferent to anything at all except the simple, ancient, quietly brilliant work of keeping the people inside it warm and safe until morning finally, gently, decides to arrive. Sleep well wherever you are. Let the last of tonight's thoughts go soft and loose and unimportant. There is nothing more you need to do tonight, nothing more you need to figure out, Nothing left to carry except whatever small, warm image from tonight's story you would like to keep beside you as you finally, fully let go, drifting now toward whatever quiet rest is waiting for you. The fire holds, the earth holds, the whole quiet house holds everyone inside it exactly the way it was built to, and somewhere in the dark, gently, without any fuss at all, the door closes softly on this one particular night, leaving behind nothing but warmth and rest and the steady, patient promise of morning whenever you are finally ready for it to come.